David Kinney was a young man who led an ordinary life. As he reached the age of 21, his mother decided to throw a big celebration in his honor. Among the guests at this party was Sherry, a beautiful single mother who attended with her sons. During the course of the evening, David found himself deeply captivated by Sherry, feeling an instant connection. The next day, he confided in his mother that he had found the love of his life and was determined to make his relationship with Sherry official. Despite Sherry's admirable qualities, some people in David's circle questioned his decision to marry a woman with 3 young children, citing the heavy responsibility it entailed for someone so young. However, David was a young man full of commitment and love. He was ready to take on the responsibilities that came with integrating into Sherry's family and building a beautiful life together. To ensure he could provide for his new family, David enrolled in a course to become a coal miner, a tough and risky job, but one that offered good pay to cover the needs of his household. It was during this training that David met Brad McGary. Brad, born in the 1970s in Cambridge, Ohio, had faced numerous challenges growing up. Openly gay in a conservative environment, Brad had endured insults and prejudice but had always stood firm in living his truth. Over time, he built a close-knit group of friends and pursued a career in hairstyling, though in a small, working-class town, it was a challenging profession. Eventually, Brad made the bold decision to switch careers, opting to become a coal miner, despite the stark contrast to his previous work. David and Brad quickly became friends, with Brad even becoming a beloved figure in David's family, earning the affectionate nickname Uncle Brad from David's children. The two friends were inseparable, always sharing jokes and good times together. By 2017, David was 30 years old, happily married to Sherry, and their children were growing up. Brad, on the other hand, was balancing his work, family time, and a secret romance. On May 7, 2017, after attending a family gathering, Brad told a cousin that he needed to return to his home for a meeting. Later that day, around 6:15 p.m., David, Sherry, and their youngest daughter stopped by Brad's house. They were surprised when Brad didn't answer the door, even though his car was parked outside. Concerned, they went around to the back of the house and found the service door unlocked. After calling out to Brad without a response, David entered the house while Sherry searched upstairs. David's search led him to the basement, where he was met with a horrifying sight: Brad's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. Sherry, responding to her husband's scream, rushed downstairs and was equally shocked by the grim scene. Sherry immediately called 911, and the police were soon alerted to the discovery of Brad's body, the victim of a fatal gunshot wound. When the police arrived, they found David and Sherry visibly shaken, recounting their story of how they had come to check on their friend and were met with a terrible tragedy. The couple explained their close relationship with Brad, emphasizing the deep bond that had formed over the years. The Kinney family shared that they often spent holidays with Brad, and their children loved him like an uncle. They had even planned a trip to the Bahamas with him in August of that year. When asked about any enemies or troubling circumstances in Brad's life, David and Sherry mentioned that Brad had recently ended a tumultuous relationship with a man named Scotty, although they didn't know his last name. They described the relationship as fraught with conflict, with frequent heated arguments. After gathering as much information as possible from the witnesses, the officers began to thoroughly examine the scene before drawing any conclusions. In the basement, they found Brad's body lying face down on the floor, with a large pool of blood surrounding his head. At first glance, it was clear that he had been shot at least once in the head. Despite the obvious signs, the officers initially speculated that Brad might have been going through a difficult time and possibly taken his own life. When the forensic expert arrived at the scene, he asked the officers if they had found a weapon, to which they replied that they had not. However, since it's common for individuals who take their own lives to fall on the weapon, the forensic team decided to turn the body over. Upon doing so, they found no weapon, quickly dispelling the initial suicide theory. As they continued to survey the house, the police tried to piece together the crime scene. They noticed that the house seemed to have been ransacked in a peculiar way. The kitchen was in disarray, with several drawers left open, and the living room was also in a state of chaos. The authorities initially suspected that Brad's death might have been the result of a robbery gone wrong. However, after conducting a more thorough inspection, the detectives realized that no valuable items had been stolen, despite there being several worth taking. They also noted that Brad was a collector of rural-style art, and his home contained many valuable items. If the intruder had been a common thief, it was also odd that the television remained in place and there was money scattered on the floor. Considering all these clues, the police became convinced that the robbery was staged to mislead them. Given that Brad was an openly gay man working in a coal mine, the detectives considered the possibility that he might have upset some of his more conservative co-workers, potentially leading to a hate crime. However, when they spoke with his colleagues at the mine, they were surprised to find that everyone respected and admired Brad, describing him as a good man. This theory was quickly discarded. The detectives also interviewed Brad's friends and family, trying to establish a timeline and gather as much information as possible. According to David and Sherry's statement at the scene, Brad had recently ended a toxic relationship with a man named Scotty, which was confirmed by Brad's friend, Wendy. Wendy told the police that she had also been against the relationship, noting that Brad had become too involved with Scotty, and things had started to get very strange. Following this lead, the detectives obtained the full name of Scotty and immediately went to his house to question him. However, when they arrived, Scotty's mother informed them that he had been in jail for 3 months for violating his probation. While this ruled out Scotty as the perpetrator, the detectives did not completely dismiss him as a suspect. They theorized that he might have orchestrated the crime from behind bars with the help of an accomplice. The police visited Scotty in jail to inform him of his ex-boyfriend's death and gauge his reaction. Scotty seemed genuinely shaken by the news, and by the end of the interview, the detectives had nearly ruled out his involvement in the crime. Desperate for answers, the detectives decided to canvass the neighborhood to see if any cameras had captured footage near Brad's house. Fortunately, a neighbor had a camera facing the street close to Brad's home, which could potentially reveal who had come and gone. While they began reviewing the hours of footage, they continued interviewing friends and family. The case seemed to be reaching a dead end until 2 days later when the detectives interviewed a cousin of Brad, whose testimony shifted the investigation. He revealed that on the day of the incident, Brad had left the family lunch gathering between 1:30 and 2 p.m., but not before mentioning that a man named DJ was supposed to visit his house. He added that Brad had jokingly said he was planning to take a nap with his guest, hinting at a romantic intention. He further disclosed that Brad had confided in her that the man he was seeing was married and had not yet come out to his wife about their homosexual relationship. He also told the detectives that the relationship with DJ had been ongoing for years and that they had managed to keep it under wraps. Despite being reluctant to reveal the true identity of Brad's lover, he finally gave in under the pressure of the lead investigator, dropping a bombshell name. The officer was stunned to hear that DJ was actually David, the very man who had discovered Brad's lifeless body. When asked if she was certain about her statements, he confirmed that David was indeed the only man Brad had ever mentioned to her. The detectives later commented that when they discovered DJ was David, the person who had found the body while visiting the house with his family, everything suddenly became clear. Up until that point, David had been viewed as a significant witness in the case, appearing genuinely shaken and grieving over his friend's death. This unexpected twist in the story, however, instantly turned him into the prime suspect. The detectives, under the guise of needing to retrieve photos from his phone related to the crime scene, convinced David to hand over his device. In reality, they were tracking his location during the time Brad was killed and searching for evidence that might confirm a relationship beyond mere friendship. When they reviewed the phone's location data, they discovered that David's phone had been at Brad's house at the time of the fatal shooting. Although David had deleted incriminating messages, a deeper forensic analysis uncovered text messages between him and Brad that confirmed their sexual relationship. Meanwhile, the team reviewing the footage from Brad's neighbor's surveillance camera found that David had indeed driven to Brad's house just before the estimated time of the attack. Notably, he had arrived in his wife's car, not his own. They documented the duration of his visit, noting that he left about 40 minutes later. The footage also captured David returning hours later in his truck, accompanied by his family, under the pretense of delivering a weed trimmer that Brad had supposedly requested. After compiling all this evidence, the police were confident they had enough to prove that David had been at Brad's house both before and during the time of his death. It was time to confront him with the truth. When the detectives presented David with the damning data retrieved from his phone, he admitted to being at the house but changed his story multiple times during the lengthy interrogation, offering up to 7 or 8 different versions of events. At one point, David claimed that a third, unidentified man had been in Brad's house, and after a heated argument, this unknown individual shot Brad. He insisted that the man had threatened him into silence before allowing him to leave. However, the detective made it clear that he didn't believe this story, prompting David to alter his account once again. When pressed to tell the truth, David eventually confessed to hiding his affair from his wife, Sherry, but insisted that it had only been going on for a few months, not years. He claimed that Brad had not been pressuring him to leave his wife and move in together, but had grown angry when David tried to end their romantic relationship that afternoon. David alleged that Brad had brandished a gun, waving it in his face, which terrified him. He said the argument escalated into a physical struggle, during which he managed to wrestle the gun away and shot Brad in the forehead, asserting that he had acted in self-defense. David also admitted to firing another shot at Brad while he was on the ground. The detectives quickly refuted this version of events, pointing out that the basic laws of physics made David's account impossible. The forensic analysis of Brad's body revealed that he had been shot twice, both times in the back of the head, indicating that the shooter had been standing behind him. When asked about the weapon, David claimed he had disposed of it while fleeing the scene. Law enforcement officers were seen combing the area in the days that followed, but the murder weapon was never recovered. Despite the missing weapon, the investigators were certain they had their man. Before taking David to jail, they allowed him to speak with his wife. The conversation between David and Sherry was closely observed by the detectives. David confessed to Sherry about the affair and expressed regret for not handling things differently, admitting that he couldn't undo what had been done. Sherry, shocked by the enormity of his revelation, was left speechless. David reiterated to her what he had told the detectives. Sherry, through tears, asked him if he was mocking her with such an explanation and said she couldn't even bear to look at him. This conversation confirmed to the police that Sherry had no prior knowledge of the events that had transpired behind her back. On May 9th, David was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators hypothesized that Brad, frustrated with keeping their relationship a secret, had likely threatened to reveal the truth to Sherry, giving David the motive to kill his friend and maintain his double life. After several days in custody, David appeared in court for a marathon preliminary hearing held in mid-May 2017. There, he faced charges for the murder of Brad. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor as the investigating officers testified, and the prosecutors focused on the inconsistencies in the story he had told them. The police described how David had appeared visibly distraught at the scene of Brad's murder, experiencing physical discomfort, including trouble breathing and episodes of vomiting. He also recounted David's initial written statement, in which he claimed to be a simple friend who had gone to deliver a weed trimmer and had inadvertently discovered Brad's lifeless body in the basement. The lead investigator presented David's final statement, in which he confessed to shooting Brad in self-defense with a weapon that, despite exhaustive efforts, was never found. The autopsy results were a critical turning point that completely dismantled David's self-defense claim, as they showed that the victim, Brad, had been shot twice in the back of the head, which was inconsistent with an act of self-defense. David's defense attorney addressed the court, arguing that David did not pose a threat to society, and that the tragic events leading to Brad's death were the result of unique circumstances. He asserted that if a crime had been committed, it was manslaughter, not murder, and claimed that David had acted in self-defense. Meanwhile, David remained silent during the nearly 3-hour hearing, where witnesses took the stand. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the judge found probable cause to send the case to the county court and set bail at $1 million. David's defense immediately requested a reduction in the bail amount, arguing that it was impossible for David to pay. However, the judge denied the request. Several weeks later, David's defense attorney filed more than a dozen motions during a hearing. Among these motions was another request to reduce David's bail. Numerous friends and family members of David attended the hearing to show their support. The lawyer asked that the bail be reduced to $250,000, an amount that the Kinney family could manage. He called several witnesses to the stand, including David's wife, his mother, his father-in-law, and his stepfather. All of them testified to David's good character, describing him as an honorable, hard-working, and responsible man, as well as a loving husband and father. Sherry testified that her husband had provided emotional and material support to their 3 children for the past 10 years, even though he was not their biological father. During cross-examination, Sherry was questioned about the events of May 7th, when David took her and their daughter to Brad's house. She said her husband told her they were going to return a weed trimmer. When asked by the judge if her husband had acted strangely that day, Sherry said she did not notice anything unusual at the house. She described how they arrived, knocked on the door, found the back door open, and entered the house, which appeared to have been ransacked, before David went to the basement and shouted for her to call 911. After hearing all the arguments, the judge concluded that the testimonies regarding David's character did not justify a reduction in bail. He based his decision on the fact that the defendant had taken his wife and daughter to a house where a dead body was present, under the pretense that he was just passing by and was unaware of what had happened. The judge added that David had blatantly lied to his wife and daughter. Later, David's trial began and lasted for a week. During the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence we've already discussed, such as the neighbor's surveillance video showing David arriving at Brad's house before the time of the crime and returning later with his family. The prosecution also showed police body cam footage that clearly demonstrated David had been lying from the start. One of the most striking pieces of testimony came from a forensic expert who discussed the DNA evidence found at the scene. The expert revealed that DNA from a used condom showed Brad's DNA on the outside and the DNA of an unknown male on the inside, but there was no trace of David's DNA. This revelation was controversial because it contradicted the accusations made by a detective who believed that David had decided Brad had to die to keep his secret and his family life intact. According to the detective, David had lured Brad with the promise of sex, killed him, and then covered up the crime as best he could. Meanwhile, the defense maintained that David had acted out of fear and in self-defense. Although the defense attorney admitted that David had not always told the truth and that some of his actions were odd, he reiterated that this did not make David a criminal. The prosecution countered that 2 bullets to the back of the head were not acts of self-defense, pointing out that Brad had been on his knees when he received the first shot to the upper part of his head and the second to the lower part of his skull. After hearing the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. Tension filled the courtroom as the jury returned, and when the judge read the unanimous verdict, they found David Kinney guilty of the aggravated murder of Brad. The verdict was met with gasps and tears from those present. Before his sentence was handed down, David was given the opportunity to speak. He began by apologizing to Brad's family for all the pain and suffering he had caused. He said he never intended for any of this to happen and wished he could take it all back. David acknowledged that no amount of apologies could ever bring Brad back, but he wanted the family to know that he truly regretted everything that had occurred. However, the judge was unmoved by David's apologies. The judge recounted the numerous lies David had told to cover up his actions and stated that the crime was a cold and calculated execution followed by an elaborate cover-up. The judge said that David had premeditated Brad's murder, luring him with the promise of sex, setting up the crime scene, and taking multiple steps to conceal his crime. The judge had 4 sentencing options, all involving life imprisonment but varying in the possibility of parole after 20, 25, or 30 years. David's defense attorney urged the judge to choose one of these options, arguing that David had been a law-abiding citizen with no criminal record before the tragic events of that day. However, the prosecutor urged the judge to impose life without parole, emphasizing that Brad had lost his life and that his family would have to live with that loss forever. In response, the judge stated that if David was capable of ending the life of someone who loved him and was his best friend, it raised concerns about what he might do to someone who opposed him. Therefore, he could not allow David to ever return to public life. In February 2018, David was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, with an additional 3 years for a firearm specification, meaning he had possessed a weapon while committing the crime. The police remarked that the entire case was a tragedy that could have been avoided if David had not been so concerned with keeping his homosexuality a secret. As of mid-2023, prison records indicated that David remained incarcerated in Ohio. From the moment of his conviction, his attorney had tried to appeal the sentence, always seeking the possibility of parole for his client, but those appeals had been denied. Tragically, while David would never return to the coal mines, Brad would not either, as both their lives had been irreversibly altered by David's actions. Vilma Gabriela Niño de Guzmán de la Rosa was born in Peru in the late 1940s. She married José Tejada Ramirez, a man 21 years her senior. José had an older son from his first marriage. After they started living, he increasingly started distancing from his previous family, including his son. Vilma had a strong and reserved character. In contrast, she was a woman who reserved all her tenderness and dedication for the plants in her garden. Caring for them meticulously, talking to them and observing them daily was an activity that offered her unparalleled peace. When she finally felt the call of motherhood, it was not easy for her to fulfill her dream. Jose was over 70 years old while she had already passed her most fertile age. However, she was not one to give up easily. Thus, the couple decided to undergo fertility treatment. Finally, after a long struggle, at 49, Vilma received what she considered the best news of her life. She was pregnant. Later, when the couple learned they were expecting a girl, Jose felt tremendous joy. It seemed like a miracle, one he could never have imagined at his age. For her part, Vilma promised to be the best mother possible for the child. The little girl came into the world at the start of the new millennium, and they named her Stephanie. Healthy, rosy-cheeked, and cheerful, as the girl grew, she confirmed to her parents that the decision to have her had been the best. With her smile and vivacity, awakened in both a new energy and tenderness they had not known before. Over time, the girl proved to be very coquettish, feminine, and a fashion lover. Although the exact date is unknown, Jose suffered a stroke. While he survived, the aftermath was significant, as Jose was left disabled and was later diagnosed with senile dementia. Meanwhile, Vilma had to face raising her daughter alone. Her ambition was for Stephanie to become a righteous woman and, hopefully, a future doctor in medicine. However, as often happens, Stephanie's entry into puberty brought changes in her behavior. It was 2012, and suddenly, the once sweet and warm girl began showing signs of rebellion. As expected, this transformation also disrupted the mother-daughter relationship. Suddenly, that residence became the scene of constant confrontations that grew more frequent over time. Most of these fights occurred when Vilma forbade her daughter from going out with friends. For Stephanie, being locked up at home was tormenting, even perceiving it as a prison. In April of that same year, the young girl took an interest in another student from her high school named Fernando. He was a fairly calm boy, with many friends and no history of violence or rebellious behavior. When they met, it was love at first sight for him. Stephanie was not only a beautiful girl, but also confident and decisive. Thus, they quickly became a couple. At 15, Fernando felt on top of the world, capable of anything. But sometime later, everything changed. By the end of 2012, the relationship between the teenagers was tumultuous, as evidenced by a letter that Stephanie wrote to him. In her own handwriting, the young girl boasted of knowing her own charms perfectly, making it clear that if he didn't measure up, she could easily replace him with another boy. Although Vilma learned of her daughter's relationship, she initially tried not to interfere. After all, she believed it was likely just a fleeting, insignificant romance typical of Stephanie's age. But months passed with no sign of the affair ending. Meanwhile, Stephanie took control of the relationship, knowing how to dominate Fernando. She liked to give orders and, of course, to be obeyed. When this did not happen, she punished him, scratching him, justifying it by saying he well deserved it. Far from leaving her, or at least reacting, Fernando endured the situation, hopelessly in love, to the point of even setting aside his preferences, dignity, or social life. Because by then, the relationship also distanced him from his friends. Judging by some leaked text messages, the young man felt lost and, in essence, suffered greatly after each fight with his girlfriend. An example of this is an audio message Fernando sent to Stephanie at 2 a.m. on January 6, 2013. Besides showing how insecure he was regarding her feelings, Fernando said some quite worrying things, talking about ending someone's life and seeking his girlfriend's support for these ideas. Although it was not clear to whom Fernando was referring, It was true that around that time, Stephanie had started flirting with other young men. And of course, in the school environment, the news quickly spread. Upon hearing the rumors, Vilma opposed the relationship between her daughter and Fernando. This became the cause of countless fights. Refusing to obey her mother, Stephanie continued to see Fernando in secret. On Saturday, January 11th, 2014, just before noon, the girl snuck her boyfriend into her house. They then went up to the second floor, to her room, where they locked themselves in to watch TV and later had an intimate encounter. When Fernando's father noticed his son's absence, suspecting he had returned to Stephanie, he began calling him on the phone. Distracted, or perhaps anticipating his father's reproaches, Fernando did not answer. However, his father was not willing to give up, so he went to Stephanie's house to look for him. Once there, the man's shouts made Vilma come out of her room on the first floor. Although she ignored him and did not open the door, she immediately understood what was happening. Filled with anger, Vilma went upstairs and, without a word, broke into the room where her teenage daughter was with her boyfriend. It was at that moment that a fight broke out between the three, but it was an unequal struggle, as Fernando soon managed to immobilize the woman. At that moment, Stephanie delivered a strong blow to her mother's head. The force was such that Vilma fell to the floor, dying. Immediately after, the teenager placed the body under her bed. Then Fernando and she went to the bathroom to clean themselves. At 90 years old and with senile dementia, Jose heard nothing and was unaware of anything. After that, Fernando went home. Later that same day, Stephanie kept in touch with dozens of people through her social media accounts. She confessed she felt that her heart was at peace and that her problems had finally ended, expressing the pleasurable feelings she was experiencing without specifying the reason. From that moment, Stephanie moved into her mother's room, which was about 10 meters away from hers. Additionally, she took the savings Vilma had, just over $10,000, and went on a shopping spree, spending as she pleased. 48 hours later, she posted a photo taken with her cell phone camera, in which she appeared wearing short floral pants and a pink blouse, holding a small puppy she had just bought in her right hand. She also paid for a change of style. As days passed, the teenager remained calm, even with her mother's decomposing body in the house. She continued to party with friends on several occasions. Jose, due to his health condition and advanced age, did not receive the care he needed from his daughter. When the smell from the second floor became unbearable, she and Fernando sprayed the room with various cleaning products and insecticides. They also partially covered the stained wall with black paint. Meanwhile, despite not being particularly friendly with them, the neighbors noticed that Vilma had not been seen watering the plants in her garden for a while. On January 16th, Stephanie called Fernando to tell him that 3 people were going to help her take out her mother's remains. According to his later testimony, Fernando suddenly felt a great repulsion towards his girlfriend, almost as if for the first time he fully understood what kind of person she was. He then decided to end their relationship. Although he no longer communicated with her or saw her, Stephanie tried to contact him in any way possible. Realizing that her text messages and calls were not being answered, the minor spoke with Marco, a cousin of Fernando's, and through him, she sent messages via one of her social media accounts. There, with encrypted messages, she asked him not to do anything foolish and not to say anything about what had happened. By that time, Vilma's loved ones had tried to contact her without success. Every time they asked Stephanie, she gave some excuse. After some time, they stopped believing her explanations and began to suspect that something had happened to her. In early March 2014, Vilma's relatives reported her strange disappearance to the authorities. Consequently, on the night of Sunday, March 9th of that year, the police arrived at the house with them. When they did not receive a satisfactory response from Stephanie about her mother's prolonged absence, the officers broke into the property with the family's authorization. Once inside, they found Stephanie nervously giving them the runaround in an attempt to hinder the authorities' progress. But the young woman's efforts were in vain, as the strong smell and the flies buzzing all over the place only heightened the police's worst fears. Upon turning the key to the room, the macabre scene was revealed in a matter of seconds. For 57 days, Vilma's body had been there, in the room of the daughter. Forensic experts at the scene found a knife, which was taken for analysis to determine if it had been used to kill Vilma. The authorities immediately considered Stephanie the main suspect in the crime. However, in her version of events, she tried to absolve herself of any responsibility and accused Fernando. Within minutes, reporters swarmed the surroundings of the house. The head of the Criminal Investigation Division informed the press of what was known so far, based on the minor's statements. Thus, both the motive and the cause of Vilma's death were still under investigation. The 65-year-old woman's body was transferred for forensic examinations. Meanwhile, news cameras managed to enter the house and obtained images of the teenager's room. There, marks on the floor were still visible, despite the presence of several bottles of different elements, presumably used to erase them. It wasn't until the following day, Monday, March 10, 2014, that the police formalized the request to initiate a process for violation of criminal law for the crimes committed by the 14-year-old minor. Consequently, Stephanie was forced to remain in a juvenile center for the duration of the process. In the early hours of Tuesday, amidst the tumult of reporters and neighbors, agents transferred Stephanie as some of those present shouted accusations at her. Due to her status as a minor, she wore her face semi-hidden with a cap. Nevertheless, she took advantage of the cameras and microphones to defend herself. During the police interrogation, Stephanie added more details to her version of events. This time, she said that her mother became enraged upon discovering her with her boyfriend and then hit her with an iron bar. At that moment, Fernando came to her defense and attacked Vilma, injuring her in the left eye. They struggled, and then he pulled out a knife. She took the blade from him and tried to attack him, but he crawled away and with another blunt object hit Vilma 3 more times in the head. The story continued with Stephanie going to the bathroom to clean the wound her own mother had inflicted on her. By that time, Vilma was already showing no signs of life, and Fernando also approached the sink to wash off the traces of the crime they had just committed. In conclusion, Stephanie only admitted to hiding the body. A few hours later, after being summoned by the authorities, Fernando appeared at the police station to give his testimony. He arrived accompanied by his father and his lawyer. The detectives heard from the young man that all responsibility for the crime lay exclusively with Stephanie. Furthermore, Fernando claimed that the girl was tired of the constant physical abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother. The boy recounted that the teenager used the same bar with which her mom had hit her several times. However, Fernando's version did not convince the police either, as he made serious contradictions during the interrogation. Consequently, the police decided that the young man should be held as the suspected co-author and accomplice of the homicide. It was up to the prosecution to decide whether to charge him. On the afternoon of March 12th, 60 days after the crime, Vilma's body was removed from the morgue and was taken directly to the cemetery, where she was buried in the presence of family and friends. One of the victim's nieces called for the maximum penalty for the 2 minors involved, adding that for teenagers, it seemed all too easy to kill without facing responsibilities. She also mentioned that Stephanie was very much loved by her mother and denied there was a bad relationship between them. Meanwhile, the prosecution's decision led to Fernando's arrest. The teenager was placed in a juvenile center. experts concluded that he was a young man with a tendency towards introversion, easily influenced by a figure that generated emotional attachment. They also indicated that Fernando submitted to his partner's wishes, allowing himself to be manipulated to satisfy her desires, showing himself submissive and compliant out of fear of emotional abandonment. Regarding Stephanie, forensic psychologists saw that the young woman had psychopathological traits in her personality. Amidst the twists and turns of the case, a television report revealed that Stephanie had been influenced by another girl who was in prison for killing her mother after a heated argument on March 5, 2005. It was also stated that Stephanie stored poems of her on a tablet or personal computer. At the end of March that same year, Stephanie insisted on her innocence through a letter. There, she explained that when she misbehaved and did not obey her mother, she was hit with a towel or a notebook, but not with an iron bar. An unexpected twist was her portrayal of Fernando, whom she accused of mistreatment and threats, even against his father. The reason was simple. He was obsessed with her and aimed to socially isolate her. Lastly, she assured that she loved and respected her mother and was overwhelmed with sadness from missing her father so much. In this story, Jose too was a victim of circumstances, even though he was unaware of what was happening around him. The elderly man was left at the mercy of Vilma's family. When the firstborn finally learned of the crime and traveled from Brazil, he found that Vilma's family refused to let him see his own father. After turning to the authorities, Jose's son was finally able to rescue him. He found his father in a state of neglect and uncleanliness, and they were unable to find his documents anywhere in the house. Consequently, his lawyer reiterated his request for the relevant agency to expedite the delivery of this documentation. Without it, neither Jose nor his son could claim his pension. The entire country remained attentive to any new detail, even those concerning the daily life of the main suspect. Once transferred to a new center, Stephanie made headlines again when it was revealed that she shared a third-year classroom with another minor accused of a similar crime, Rosalinda. Her case was also highly publicized in Peru. The young girl, who had suffered excessive abuse at the hands of her mother, retaliated against her and took her life. The director of the juvenile center told a Peruvian TV program that the two girls had no problems adapting to the group and also showed acceptable performance. According to her, as part of her job, it was not her place to judge them. Instead, it was necessary to do everything possible as a system to reintegrate them into society. The young women could be confined there until they turned 20, as Peruvian law only imposes a maximum of 6 years of readaptation in juvenile centers for crimes committed by minors. For adults, the country's legislation imposes up to 35 years of effective imprisonment for those responsible for these crimes. On the night of Thursday, April 10, 2014, the crime reconstruction took place. During this, the young woman smiled, made victory gestures, and showed no remorse. Fernando also participated, but, unlike Stephanie, chose not to speak to the press and preferred to hide his face, wearing a bulletproof vest at all times. Both arrived from their respective juvenile centers and had no contact with each other during the procedure. However, coldly and without showing regret, they attacked and accused each other. Upon leaving the scene, Stephanie began to play with her hair as the cameras from photographers and television stations focused on her. Meanwhile, Fernando's defense argued that the accusation against their client was full of contradictions. The psychological assessment of the crime scene, conducted by experts, found evidence of cruelty, planning, and simulation of the events, including the use of air fresheners and wall paint to hide blood traces. Days later, Jose visited his daughter for the first time. Still coming to terms with the events and remembering little, he hoped Stephanie would tell him everything. After leaving, following a 2-hour visit, he mentioned that his daughter blamed her former boyfriend for the crime, insisting to him that she was incapable of such evil. Jose carried with him a gift from his daughter, a pink heart saying she loved him. In the second half of April 2014, Stephanie's situation worsened when investigations into her cell phone uncovered threatening messages she had sent Fernando. These texts were retrieved by the young man's family for use in court, aiming to prove that Stephanie had planned the crime. By the end of July 2014, the prosecution formally charged Stephanie as the perpetrator of her mother's murder, with Fernando deemed an accomplice to the crime. In both cases, the public ministry requested 6 years of detention in a juvenile center and a compensation payment of $1,300. The prosecution's conclusions were based on the autopsy report, psychological assessments, and the crime scene psychological appraisal. Exclusive footage of Fernando in court was captured by a television camera. Walter, Fernando's father, was outraged by the verdict, insisting that there was no evidence incriminating his son. He believed that the inability to absolve Stephanie led to Fernando being charged as an accomplice. Contrary to the father's hopes, in October 2014, Fernando was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison, while Stephanie received a 6-year sentence. After serving their sentences, Stephanie and Fernando were released, with no further updates on their lives made public. Yet, in Peru, the memory of this shocking story lingers, a story of a daughter whose miraculous birth filled her parents with joy, only to later become a figure far from the angel they had dreamt of spending their final years with. On a quiet October afternoon in 2005, a tragic accident shattered the lives of everyone involved. 14-month-old Kyle Lazer-Kck was found unresponsive in his home, his tiny body marked with mysterious injuries. The young nanny, Ayla Quadros, frantically dialed 911, but what happened next would change her life forever. As paramedics raced to the scene, the grim reality of Kyle's condition became evident. Despite Ada's desperate attempts to save him, the baby's injuries were severe. But what could have caused such a tragedy? The answers seemed elusive. Ayla Quadros was born on September 13, 1977, in the coastal town of Chimbote, Peru. She was the first child of Victor Quadros, a veterinarian, and Luz Fernandez, a teacher. Ayla was the eldest of 4 siblings and consistently excelled academically, even winning knowledge contests. She had a happy childhood filled with dreams of self-improvement. Ayla later recounted that she spent much of her childhood with one of her sisters on their grandparents' farm, enjoying the close connection with nature and animals. This period was one of the happiest times of her life. Although Ayla's family wasn't poor, they were not wealthy either. During her teenage years, she looked for ways to contribute financially. Together with her sister and a friend, she formed a group to entertain at children's parties. After high school, Ayla enrolled in a private university to study law. Unfortunately, her financial situation did not allow her to continue, and she had to drop out. Despite this setback, Ayla was determined to succeed and support her family. With this goal in mind, she applied for a U.S. visa through the lottery program. Like many young people from Peru and other Latin American countries, Ayla saw the United States as a land of opportunities. She was determined to move there, work hard, earn a better income, and pave the way for a brighter future for herself and her family. Her family was thrilled for her. They sold some belongings and did everything possible to gather enough money for her journey. Her destination was Texas, where she initially planned to stay with some relatives. In early 2004, she began working as a waitress in a restaurant. After some time, she joined a company that placed nannies in households. This is how she met the Lazer-Kck family. The Lazer-Kck family consisted of Father Michael, commonly known as Mike, Mother Renee, their eldest daughter Alyssa, and twin boys Ryan and Kyle. Little is known about the family's background except that they married in 2000. Shortly after their wedding, Renee became pregnant with their first daughter, Alyssa. Just 4 months after Alyssa's birth, Renee was expecting again, this time with twins Kyle and Ryan. The Lazer-Kck couple wanted to hire a trustworthy nanny to take care of the twins when Renee returned to work. Alyssa was already comfortable in a daycare she attended daily, where she had made several friends, so they decided she would continue going there. The couple interviewed several candidates, and Ayla stood out as the best option. At 27 years old, she was young but not a teenager. She appeared healthy, strong, well-mannered, and cheerful. Renee wanted Ayla to start immediately so she could spend a few weeks with her, explaining the household routines, where things were, and what was expected of her. She also wanted to observe how Ayla handled the young twins, who were just over a year old. The family had one specific request. They needed assurance that Ayla could commit to staying with them for 18 months, and Ayla committed to this arrangement. Initially, it was agreed that she would only spend the day at the Lazer-Kck household, but after some time, they asked her to live in, and Ayla agreed. From then on, she only left on weekends to stay at her uncle's house. Everything seemed to go smoothly. The Lazer-Kck family was pleased with Ayla's work and grew fond of her, trusting her completely. Numerous photos captured happy moments with the smiling young nanny holding the twins. However, everything changed in the summer of 2005. Ayla informed the Lazer-Kck family that her uncles were returning to Peru before moving on to Germany. Ayla was prepared to go with them and had already purchased her plane ticket for October 29th of that year. Understandably, this was disappointing news for the couple since it was not what they had agreed upon. Eventually, they understood and only asked Ayla to stay until they could find a replacement. They even requested her help in searching for and selecting her successor. Ayla agreed, but from that point on, she no longer stayed overnight at the Lazer-Kck home. Instead, she returned to her uncle's house each night and came back early in the morning. Given the change in circumstances and Ayla's impending departure, the Lazer-Kck family scheduled interviews with several nanny candidates for Wednesday, October 12th. During the day, Renee called Ayla and asked her to prepare macaroni and cheese for the children. Ayla complied and fed the kids. When Renee returned home, she greeted her children, saw they were well, and after interviewing the candidates, spent over an hour with her little ones before they went to bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, at 5 a.m. on Thursday, October 13th, Kyle woke up crying, which was unusual. The twins were typically heavy sleepers and never woke up on their own. It always took someone to wake them. Nonetheless, Renee got up, went to the twins' room, picked up Kyle, and soothed him until he fell back asleep. She then returned to bed. 2 hours later, at 7:30, Mike went to the children's room, woke them up, hugged and kissed them, and left them in Ayla's care before heading to work. Renee woke up just before 9:30 and spent some time with the twins. She changed Ryan's diaper, said goodbye to both him and Kyle, and left for work. The children were fine, with nothing out of the ordinary except Kyle's early wake-up. That day, their older sister Alyssa went to daycare as usual. But things took a dramatic turn around 1 p.m. when Ayla called 911, highly agitated, saying that one of the children, Kyle, had stopped breathing and was turning blue. After providing the address, the operator gave Ayla instructions to perform CPR on the child. Ayla followed the instructions while paramedics were on their way. A few minutes later, they arrived at the house and took over Kyle's care. They asked Ayla what had happened, and she, very distressed, explained that after lunch, she had put Kyle in his crib and returned to get his brother. But when she got back with Ryan, Kyle started vomiting and stopped breathing. While paramedics attended to Kyle, Ayla called Renee to inform her of the situation, giving her a different version of events. She said that after feeding the children, she took Kyle out of his high chair and, as usual, placed him on the playroom floor while she fetched his brother. But when she returned, Kyle was vomiting. She went to the kitchen to get a bowl to catch the vomit, and when she returned, Kyle had fallen. She said she picked him up, took him to the sink, and performed the maneuver Renee had taught her in case one of the children stopped breathing. But it didn't work, and she also attempted CPR. After initial treatment, the paramedics transported Kyle to the nearest hospital. When Renee arrived at the house, the ambulance with her son had already left, but the police were still at the scene. Renee took Ryan, the other twin, and asked Ayla to accompany them. They followed the police, who escorted them to the hospital. During the drive, Renee called her husband and they met at the medical center. A few minutes later, the doctors decided to transfer Kyle by helicopter to the Dallas Children's Hospital. The Lazer-Kcks returned home, left Ayla to care for Ryan, and headed to the Dallas Children's Hospital. Ayla asked them to keep her informed about Kyle's condition. On the way to the hospital, Renee started worrying that Ayla might be too nervous to look after Ryan properly, so she called a friend to assist the nanny at the house. Shortly after, her friend arrived at the house. Ayla, visibly distressed and crying, opened the door for her. She asked Ayla to explain what had happened. According to her account, Ayla said that Kyle was standing between the playroom and the kitchen when he suddenly collapsed. Ayla claimed she dropped a plate she was holding, picked Kyle up, took him to the living room, and performed CPR on him. She recalled Ayla mentioning that Kyle's brain hadn't fully developed and that this issue had started at birth. She didn't fully understand, but Ayla kept talking, saying she loved Kyle and would never hurt him. She tried to calm the very upset nanny, reassuring her that she hadn't done anything wrong and that she was a good person. Meanwhile, at the Dallas Children's Hospital, the Lazer-Kck family received devastating news. The doctor in charge of Kyle reported that the child had suffered severe head injuries, with multiple bruises on his head, arm, and left shoulder. A neurosurgeon met with the distressed parents to explain that something had to be done to relieve the pressure on Kyle's brain, though survival was unlikely. A child abuse specialist who also met with Mike and Renee suggested that Kyle's injuries could be consistent with abuse. The specialist stated that Kyle's injuries were so severe, it was as if he had been in a car accident or fallen from a sixth floor. Initially, Renee couldn't believe it. She thought Ayla might have accidentally dropped the child or was too scared or ashamed to admit it. But the doctors clearly explained the extent of Kyle's head injuries and the force required to cause them. With this information, the possibility of an accident seemed implausible. Renee immediately called another friend to pick up Ryan and take him away from the house. While this was happening at the hospital, Ayla became increasingly anxious at home. Renee's friend had to leave to pick up her son from school and take him home. During her absence, Ayla called her several times, asking if there was any news about Kyle. When Renee's friend returned to the house, she found Ayla calm. Ayla was no longer crying or talking. Shortly after, a police car drove by the house. Upon seeing it, Ayla lost her composure. She began crying uncontrollably and shouting, "No, no, no." She collapsed to the floor behind a door, repeatedly insisting she would never harm Kyle. 2 female detectives arrived to interview Ayla as the person who had called 911 about the injured child. She had been the only adult present when the incident occurred. As the detectives located the house and got out of their patrol car, they heard Ayla's cries. Upon entering, they found her extremely agitated. When Ayla was able to speak, she explained that she had taken Kyle out of his high chair and placed him on the playroom floor. She was patting his back to help him burp when he suddenly began to vomit. Ayla said she went to the kitchen to get a container to catch the vomit, as Renee disliked stains on the floor. While she was cleaning, Kyle turned blue, fell, and started convulsing. She claimed she took him to the living room, called 911, and followed the dispatcher's instructions. During the interview, the other officer called the hospital to get an update on Kyle's condition. When they discovered the diagnosis, detectives told Ayla that her story did not account for the injuries Kyle had. Ayla suggested that Kyle might have hit his head when he fell after she left him alone in the playroom. But the officers noted that the playroom floor was covered with soft rugs, making this explanation unlikely. Trying to offer another explanation, Ayla said that Kyle might have hit his head on the door frame when she carried him on her hip. At the officer's insistence, Ayla demonstrated how Kyle could have been hurt and mentioned that Mike and Renee often bumped Kyle's head without any problems. The officer checked the spot where Ayla claimed Kyle hit his head but found no evidence of a strong impact. When the officers told her that the injury didn't seem severe enough to cause the extensive damage the doctors described, Ayla insisted that the impact was strong because she was running with Kyle in her arms. She also stated that she had never shaken or hit either of the twins. The officers urged Ayla to tell the truth, as it could save Kyle's life, but Ayla provided no further explanation. Given the circumstances, the officers reported the situation to their command and took Ayla into preventive custody for further questioning. Meanwhile, crime scene investigation units arrived to examine the house. After completing their task, they informed Renee's friend, who had stayed at the house on behalf of the owners, that they could clean up and organize everything for the family's return. While several friends cleaned the house, they found a piece of adhesive tape sticking out from the door of a cabinet under the kitchen island. When they opened the door, they noticed it was broken and held together by tape. As a result, opening it caused the door to become misaligned. They simply placed it back and secured it with the tape, but found it strange because Renee was always careful with broken items to prevent the children from getting hurt. They had a hunch and called the police to report the door. Shortly after, investigators returned to collect potential evidence. Later, when questioned about the cabinet door, Renee stated that she frequently used that door and had never seen it held with adhesive tape. By Friday, October 14th, all of Mike and Renee's hopes had vanished. The doctors informed them that Kyle was brain dead and had no chance of recovery. Amid indescribable pain, the couple authorized the removal of life support, after which Kyle passed away. 3 days later, on October 17th, the detectives interviewed Ayla in prison, where she was accused of premeditated assault on a minor. This time, Ayla claimed that the day before the incident, she was preparing the macaroni and cheese that Renee had requested. She had Kyle sitting on the kitchen counter, and the child fell, landing headfirst on the kitchen floor and hitting his head hard. Ayla said she picked him up and checked for injuries. The only thing she noticed was redness on his ear and the right side of his head, so she applied cold compresses and gave him a pain reliever. When the interrogators asked why she hadn't told this to the other officers, Ayla said she thought they wouldn't believe her. She mentioned that she didn't tell Renee because when she arrived home from work, she complained of a severe headache. Ayla said Renee suffered from migraines and had requested that the lights be turned off and the house be kept quiet. The interrogators asked if she had fallen with the child, which she adamantly denied. During that interrogation, Ayla learned that Kyle had died, and she cried for the rest of the interview. Ayla was brought before the courts, where a judge charged her with aggravated homicide and set bail at $750,000, which was beyond the means of Ayla or her family, so she remained in custody until the trial. At that time, the police indicated that she might be charged with premeditated actions, which could carry the death penalty. The case of Kyle's death went to trial in the second half of 2005. The doctor who examined Kyle at Dallas Children's Hospital testified that when he received Kyle, the child was already unconscious. He described multiple hematomas on the right side of Kyle's head, as well as bruises on the left side of his head and shoulder and both arms. Additionally, there were 2 small hemorrhages forming hematomas on the right temple. Kyle had 3 main areas of hematomas on his head, indicating 3 separate impacts. He added that the bruises were relatively recent, one possibly 12 to 16 hours old. Internally, Kyle had brain and retinal bleeding, indicative of severe trauma, even though there were no broken bones. The brain tissue was notably swollen, and the pressure inside Kyle's head was 90 millimeters of mercury, whereas the normal level is 20 millimeters. Based on these findings, he concluded that Kyle had suffered severe traumatic events consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly from someone hitting his head against a hard object. He suggested the type of injuries could result from shaking and swinging a young child's head against a solid object, like a kitchen cabinet door. A Dallas County forensic expert testified that the autopsy revealed multiple, overlapping small hematomas on Kyle's scalp, along with a couple of punctate abrasions on the right temple, separated by over a centimeter. There were also 4 or 5 pairs of similar lesions on his head. His brain showed significant hemorrhage and swelling, with retinal hemorrhages in both eyes, requiring substantial force to cause such injuries. She concluded that the cause of death was severe head injuries from blunt force trauma, agreeing that Kyle's head might have been struck multiple times against the wooden door of the kitchen cabinet. She ruled out the possibility that Kyle had merely bumped into a door frame or fallen from the kitchen counter. Another critical testimony came from a forensic analyst who measured the distance between the fasteners on the broken kitchen cabinet door and found it matched the punctate abrasions on Kyle's head. This expert also analyzed the adhesive tape used to repair the cabinet door and discovered 2 DNA traces, one of which had a much higher contribution and matched Ayla's DNA. The lesser trace could not be identified. After hearing from the experts, it was Mike's turn to testify. He stated that Kyle was fine on the night of October 12th and the morning of October 13th with no bruises. He also mentioned that he prepared breakfast that morning, opening and closing the kitchen cabinet doors to get utensils and food, and that all doors were in perfect condition, including the one later found inexplicably repaired with tape. The parents shared that they had breakfast with the children and played with blocks, with the twins crawling around a playhouse. Based on all the evidence, it was easy to conclude that the events leading to Kyle's death occurred when no other adults were in the house except Ayla. The case prosecutor stated that the exact circumstances of what happened to Kyle might never be known for sure, but based on the evidence presented at trial, she painted a possible scenario. Perhaps Kyle didn't want to eat his lunch, and Ayla, feeling frustrated or distracted by watching a soap opera, might have taken him out of his high chair without noticing the cabinet door was open. The prosecutor speculated that Ayla's rage might have triggered the vicious attack on Kyle's head using the cabinet door until it broke, with the door's screws leaving marks on the child. After all the testimonies and closing arguments, the jury went to deliberate. Upon returning, they found Ayla Quadros guilty of capital murder of a child under 6 years old. As the verdict was read, Ayla's mother, Luz Fernandez, who had traveled from Peru when her daughter was arrested, stood up and shouted that she would free Ayla because she was innocent. She proclaimed that there was no evidence to convict her daughter and vowed to start over and appeal. After the jury members left, Kyle's parents showed photographs and videos of their deceased son, recounting his brief 14 months of life from birth to the last photo taken days before his death. Family members spoke about Kyle, while others simply couldn't stop crying. Ayla was sentenced the following year in 2006 to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Ayla and her family, giving up was not an option. Her parents immediately started a campaign to appeal the sentence, arguing that Ayla's conviction was based on racial prejudice and ineffective public defense. However, appealing required money for legal representation and process costs, which the family did not have. Undeterred, they sought support from various sources, including the Peruvian government, the Peruvian and Latino communities in the United States, and solidarity organizations in Peru. In prison, Ayla maintained her innocence and took every opportunity for interviews to assert it. Their persistence paid off, and in 2009, Ayla's legal representation filed an appeal, citing 5 specific errors in the initial trial. After reviewing the case, the appeals court dismissed 3 of the claims but agreed with 2. This was enough for the judges to overturn the conviction and annul the trial due to irregularities. Following this decision, Ayla's family began another fundraising effort to cover the $100,000 needed for a new trial. It took another 3 years to prepare for the new trial, which began on July 10, 2012, with the selection of 12 jurors from over 100 candidates. The trial took place in Collin County's Justice Hall. The defense argued that Kyle had fallen from the kitchen counter on October 12th, injuring his head, and the situation worsened the next day when Ayla, running with the child in her arms, accidentally struck his head on the doorframe. This time, the defense presented testimony from a forensic expert with 40 years of experience. He suggested that some of Kyle's bruises might have been caused at the hospital during catheter insertion to assess brain swelling. The prosecution fiercely challenged this testimony. David Gardner, an employee of the kitchen cabinet manufacturer, also testified for the defense. He proposed alternative explanations for the broken cabinet door, though he didn't entirely rule out that Kyle's head could have been struck against it. A poignant moment in the trial was Mike's testimony, where he described Kyle's last 2 days connected to numerous tubes and machines, eventually being taken off life support and dying in his parents' arms. The defense argued there wasn't enough evidence to convict Ayla, but the prosecution highlighted the medical findings and the numerous times Ayla changed her story. After the sessions concluded, the jury deliberated for 5 hours, even requesting to listen to the 911 call recordings again. Ultimately, they once again found Ayla Quadros, then 33, guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole. Back in prison, Ayla joined the prison volleyball team, learned Braille, and won an art contest with a drawing of the Virgin Mary, which she auctioned to raise funds for a new appeal. Ayla, from her cell, maintains her innocence, her spirit unbroken as she and her family continue their fight for an appeal, seeking a chance to prove what they believe to be the truth. Ayla Reynolds was born on April 4, 2010 in Waterville, a city in the state of Maine, United States. She was a beautiful girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and an irresistible smile. She loved music and dancing to the rhythm of her favorite songs. Her parents, Ayla Reynolds and Justin DiPietro, were not a couple but had known each other for a long time. They had a brief romance in the summer of 2009, resulting in Ayla getting pregnant. The news was particularly surprising for Justin, who had no intention of having a child with Ayla and even doubted he was the father. When Ayla gave birth to Ayla, the resemblance to Justin was undeniable, but he still refused to acknowledge her as his daughter. A paternity test in July 2010 finally made him accept his parenthood. Consequently, in December of the same year, he was ordered by Child Protective Services to provide child support. Ayla and Justin didn't have a court-approved custody agreement. However, Ayla, who lived in Portland, had the primary physical custody of Ayla thanks to an arrangement between them. It was only in mid-2011, after Ayla's first birthday, that Justin started having visits with her. He lived an hour and a half away, and the encounters were meant to be during the day and very brief. They agreed that he could occasionally take Ayla with him, but never overnight. In the months following Ayla's birth, Ayla became pregnant again, this time by her fiancé Raymond. Thus, in 2011, Ayla became the elder sister to Raymond Jr., and Ayla managed the care of both children. Everything changed on October 13, 2011, when Ayla had an encounter with Child Protective Services. The details of the complaint that led to this meeting are not clear, but it was known that Ayla had a substance abuse problem. That day, officials gave her an ultimatum: overcome her addiction or lose her children. Immediately, Ayla entered a 10-day rehabilitation program and left her children in the care of her mother and sister. Ayla and Raymond were her world, and she was determined not to lose them. By October 2011, Justin had seen Ayla approximately 5 to 10 times. However, just 4 days after Ayla's internment on October 17th, Justin and his family decided they wanted custody of Ayla. Justin's mother, Phoebe DiPietro, contacted Child Protective Services and received approval to take Ayla. The official call to inform Ayla's relatives about the agency's decision came swiftly. When Ayla's aunt heard that they had
to hand over Ayla, she criticized the decision, claiming that Justin was abusive and had harmed the child in the past. The officials argued that a father has more rights to custody than an aunt. Once permission was granted, Justin and his family went to pick up Ayla, but they did not know the address. The child protection officials
provided the location through the police. Officer Charles Weaver accompanied Justin and his mother to Jessica's house, Ayla's aunt. The paternal grandmother waited in the car while Justin and the police officer went to the door, leading to a dramatic scene. Jessica implored the officer not to take the child away and warned that she wouldn't give up Ayla willingly. The officer noted that Ayla was in good spirits. She was incessantly laughing, playing, and even trying to initiate conversation. To demonstrate her point, Jessica, Ayla's sister, told the officer to observe how Ayla's behavior changed when Justin appeared. At that moment, he had just approached, and seeing him, Ayla immediately started to cry and tried to distance herself. Despite this, the officer took the child and handed her to her father. Ayla was struggling and screaming and even attempted to bite the officer when she was placed in Justin's arms. Ayla's aunt told Officer Charles that Ayla was terrified of her father and that they couldn't take the child away. Charles explained that if it were his decision, he wouldn't let Ayla go with Justin, but it wasn't up to him. He was there to enforce the directive from Child Services. It's crucial to clarify that if Justin had wanted primary physical custody of Ayla, he would have had to reach an agreement with the child's mother or otherwise undergo a judicial process to obtain a judge's approval. As we saw in the custody exchange we just recounted, there was neither an agreement nor a court involved. What was applied was the judgment of a Child Protective Services supervisor. What the official did not consider were the arrangements made by the mother herself, who had full custody for the child to remain in the care of her relatives during her temporary absence. On the other hand, before a court grants a parent exclusive physical custody of a child, usually the conditions are thoroughly evaluated, including a background check and a home visit, which did not occur in Ayla's case. In essence, in custody procedures, the child's best interest must prevail, but reportedly, no report was found to support the adopted decision. In analyses published about Ayla's case, it was believed that only the presence of imminent danger threatening the child's safety could outweigh the stability and continuity provided by staying with her maternal relatives. In this sense, it could be thought that Child Protective Services officials believed the child was at risk. If that had been the case, it is not justified that the measure was applied only to Ayla and not to her little brother Raymond. The father took the girl to his childhood home in Waterville, where he lived with his 47-year-old mother, Phoebe, his 24-year-old sister, Elisha, and her daughter, Gabriella, who, like Ayla, was a baby. At that time, Justin, 25, occupied the partially finished basement, a single large room, while the rest of the family lived upstairs. During the time spent in rehabilitation, Trista called Justin every day to speak with Ayla and ensure everything was all right. In these contexts, she perceived no warning signs. On October 20th, 2011, coinciding with the 8th day of Trista's treatment, there was a meeting to discuss Ayla's case attended by Child Protective Services members, 2 doctors, Trista and her sister Jessica, who were accompanied by a lawyer, and Justin, who participated by phone. This encounter resulted in an agreement. Ayla would be returned to her mother on October 22nd, 2011, as soon as Trista completed the addiction recovering program. It was also agreed that Justin would bring Ayla to the treatment center on the 21st for a visit. Everything was going well for Trista, but the situation would soon change. None of the established agreements were fulfilled. Desperate to regain her daughter, Trista repeatedly called Child Protective Services for help to enforce the agreement made in their presence. Since she could not get anywhere with Child Protective Services, she sought a temporary agreement with Justin. He would continue to keep the child, and she would have regular visits. On November 12, 2011, Justin took the girl to an emergency room. After conducting the pertinent studies, the doctors determined that the little girl had a broken bone in one of her joints. Specifically, the broken bone was in the joint that connects the elbow to the upper arm. Justin told the doctor that the accident had occurred the previous night on November 11th. According to his account, it was raining, and he slipped and fell on her while on the porch with Ayla in his arms. He added that although she had cried, she didn't seem to be injured, and it wasn't evident until the next morning that she required urgent medical attention. By the following Monday, the orthopedist considered that surgery wouldn't be necessary and that the injury would likely heal on its own. A week later, on November 26th, during her 3rd medical appointment to assess the child's progress, the specialist said things were going as planned. Trista was present at that medical consultation to closely follow her daughter's recovery, never thinking that this would be the last time she would hold her in her arms. From that moment, things spiraled. Tired of arguing over the custody of her daughter, over visitations, and even over her right to talk to the child on the phone, the mother decided to take a step forward. On December 15th, 2011, she filed papers in court to initiate legal proceedings to obtain full physical custody of Ayla. Just 2 days later, on Saturday, December 17th, Justin called the police in the morning to report Ayla's disappearance from his mother's house, where he was staying with his girlfriend, Courtney Roberts, and his sister, Elisha. He assured them that they had put the 20-month-old girl to bed the night before, and when they woke up, she was gone. Early that morning, Trista had started a car trip to a coastal city in Maine. just 50 miles from the Canadian border, to visit her boyfriend Raymond, who had just entered a correctional facility after being convicted of arson. She was dozing in the passenger seat while her father-in-law, Robert Fortier, drove. Robert answered a call from Trista's father, informing him that Ayla was missing. The news left him frozen, and he looked for a suitable place to stop the vehicle and wake Trista. Still drowsy, she heard her father's voice and managed to understand that her baby's whereabouts were unknown. Desperate, Trista changed her course to meet the police who were searching for her little daughter. The journey lasted an hour and a half, but for Trista, it seemed like an eternity. Throughout the trip, she frantically called Justin to find out what had happened, terrified at the lack of response. Even upon arriving at the police station, both Trista and her fiancé's father gave statements. About 30 minutes later, Trista's father joined them at the police headquarters, angry and very distressed. As it transpired, Justin had called 911 that morning at 8:49 to report the disappearance. He said the last time someone saw Ayla was the previous night around 10 p.m., when his sister Elisha checked on her before going to bed. On Saturday morning, they discovered she had disappeared from her crib, but he didn't specify the time in the call. Justin's theory was that the minor had been kidnapped by an unknown intruder. The news of the minor's disappearance spread like wildfire, and the authorities wasted no time initiating an operation. Police chief spoke to the media, stating that the case was being aggressively investigated and that their goal was to find Ayla at all costs. The police proceeded to search the house for any clues that could lead them to the minor. To facilitate operations, the family stayed with friends. At the same time, a command center was established to coordinate the search operation. On the second day, Sunday, December 18th, search dogs were deployed, and the area around the house where Ayla was last seen was searched. Trista's home also underwent a meticulous search, during which the distressed woman had to stay with her mother and younger son in a motel. Trista's father found it exceedingly difficult to sit idle, as Ayla was the apple of his eye. On the third day, Monday, December 19th, the FBI was requested to assist in the search. By this time, 75 individuals from various agencies were involved in the operation. The Maine State Police seized 2 vehicles from the Di Pietro residence. One, a 1996 Ford Explorer, belonged to Justin. The other, a 4-door silver sedan, was owned by Justin's girlfriend Courtney, who was also present on the night of the disappearance. From day one, local newspapers echoed the news the following morning. Headlines in print media were already covering the story, and 72 hours later, Trista could be seen in interviews with different local news outlets. She did not hesitate to point towards Justin. By the end of the first week, the Today Show, one of the most successful morning news programs in the United States, highlighted the news. There, Trista insisted that her daughter's father was the only one who could answer her questions, as he was the last to see her alive. On the evening of the 4th day, Justin made his first statement to the media. He appeared calm, as if the disappearance hadn't occurred while the child was under his care. He claimed to have no idea what happened to Ayla and stated he wouldn't make accusations or insinuations until the police determined who was responsible for the disappearance. He also announced that he and his family would do everything possible to aid the investigation and secure his daughter's return. During his statement, Justin acknowledged that Ayla was under his exclusive custody at the time of her disappearance, but he lied, stating that this was achieved through an agreement with the mother. Moreover, he added that Trista was incapable of taking care of the child. As days passed, the search efforts widened. The FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door. They repeatedly interviewed neighbors, hoping to uncover some revealing details. The police emphasized the significant effort underway, seeing only commitment and energy from the 75 officers dedicated to resolving the case. Until the 10th day after Justin's complaint, it was estimated that 5,000 hours of work had been invested in the search and 330 leads were being followed. The operation also involved around 50 civilian volunteers from the Search and Rescue Association. A reward of $30,000 was offered to anyone who could provide a lead that would help in recovering Ayla. Trista remained steadfast in her efforts to find her beloved daughter. The grieving mother was determined in her fight to keep everyone focused on the case. She worked with allies and support groups to organize vigils, marches, and events in memory of Ayla. News cameras were always present, and she, along with other spokespeople, offered new topics to journalists to keep the story on the front page and in the nation's mind. Gradually, the initially optimistic and hopeful message from the authorities started changing. The chief of police continued to insist that the investigation was being considered a missing person case and not a homicide. However, the mood definitively shifted when Justin's house and the surrounding area were cordoned off, the cars were confiscated, and the head of the main criminal prosecution made a public appearance. The police publicly ruled out the possibility of Ayla having walked away on her own, and on the 13th day, the police chief handed over the reins of the case to the State Police Serious Crime Unit. At that moment, an announcement nobody wanted to hear was made. The case ceased being the search for a missing girl and started being considered a criminal investigation. During the initial days, Justin tried to stay as far away from the media as possible, but gradually his presence began to become more frequent. In one of his appearances on the Today Show, he spoke about the change in the message from the law enforcement agencies, insisted that someone had kidnapped Ayla, and expressed his wish for whoever took her to return her home. He also asserted that he had come on the program hoping to reach whoever had his daughter to let them know that what they were doing was wrong. As if he knew the person in question, he spoke directly to them, saying they might think what they were doing was right for Ayla, but it wasn't. He clarified that this person had no right because they weren't her father, and that the child needed to be at home with her family. When questioned about the silence he had maintained until that point, Justin acknowledged that his efforts to cooperate had been delayed. He justified himself by stating that he had been a bit naive during the first weeks, thinking that Ayla would return. He also claimed that the law enforcement agencies had advised him to stay away from the press. This was partially confirmed by the spokesperson for the Maine Department of Public Safety, who explained that this was only said to him at the beginning. Later, the police themselves encouraged Ayla's parents to remain in the public eye. Justin took the opportunity to respond directly to the insinuations that had been made about him. He asked the television host to come see him and spend a day with him to witness what he was going through. Finally, he said that he praised the police's efforts, although some of the techniques and tactics they had to use had not been enjoyable. He pointed out that the truth is the truth. No matter how many times you are asked the same question and shouted at that you are a liar, anticipating that the truth is patient and would come to light. By the end of January, the police revealed that Ayla's blood had been found in various places in the DiPietro house. It also emerged that, while there was not enough evidence to make any arrests, Justin, Courtney, and Elisha, the three adults living in the residence where the girl was last seen, were considered suspects. Stephen McCausland, the spokesperson for the Maine Department of Public Safety, said that the family's version of events was not supported by any forensic evidence, thereby ruling out the possibility that someone could have entered the bedroom where Ayla slept alone and taken her without any of the three adults in the house noticing. 6 months after Ayla's disappearance was reported on May 30th, 2012, the police said that it was unlikely that the little girl was alive. Trista's family allowed journalists into their home as they watched the press conference where this news was announced. Trista immediately broke into tears. Then her sorrow turned to rage, and she asserted that Justin had killed her baby. For Trista's family, learning in detail the results of some forensic tests conducted at Justin's family's house was very hard. They knew Ayla's blood was found and had even been told that the amount found was equivalent to 25% of the blood volume of her body. However, they had never been in front of the evidence until January 2013, when everything discovered was revealed to them. To begin with, Justin's 1996 Ford Explorer had a baby seat in the back, and Ayla's blood was found on the left shoulder strap. There was also dried gastric fluid on the back seats. In the girl's bedroom, blood was found on some of her princess pink sneakers on the floor next to her crib, as well as on the face and arms of her doll. The investigators thought that she might have tried to clean the blood from her mouth with her toy. Additionally, a blood stain was located on the living room sofa. However, most of the blood traces were in the basement. A pool of Ayla's blood stained the center of the mattress on which Justin slept with Courtney. Moreover, vomit and an unidentified pink fiber resembling hair that could be from a toy were found on the bed. Next to the same piece of furniture were Justin's sneakers stained with Ayla's blood on the tongue and inside. Additionally, there were splashes on the cement floor around the bed and on the walls. The latter matched Ayla's height. An expert determined that some drops were the size of a dime, indicative of trauma from a blunt object. Additionally, the experts determined that some blood spatter patterns in the house might have been expelled by Ayla through coughing, indicating that her injuries were both internal and external. The police stated that bed linens had been used to clean the girl's blood. It was horrific for Trista and her family to learn these details, and they hadn't seen everything yet. The same officers exposing the gruesome evidence warned them that they were about to witness something even more horrifying. Luminol tests were conducted in the house, revealing blood traces invisible to the naked eye. The slides taken at the house devastated Trista. After seeing them, she left the police station in a panic. She was more convinced than ever that her daughter, Ayla, had been murdered. The police said there were more images to show her, but she refused to see them. She'd had enough. Reportedly, when the police showed Justin and the DiPietro family the same photographic evidence months before, he showed no reaction. The police also tried to show the photos to the family with whom the DiPietro stayed during their exile from their house while it was being processed by crime scene investigators. They refused. They were not interested. Justin's girlfriend, Courtney, who was with Justin on the night of the disappearance, had the same reaction. After confronting the compelling police findings, Trista told the press amid her unbearable pain and helplessness that Justin, Elisha, and Courtney were still walking the streets as if nothing had happened. 8 months after receiving the dramatic report in September 2013, Trista wrote an explosive letter to the press about the evidence and the photos she had been shown. She was tired of waiting and, with or without law enforcement's blessing, she wanted to rekindle public interest in the case. In spring 2016, a team of journalists went to Justin's mother's house. Elisha, Ayla's aunt, answered the door, and the journalist asked about the blood evidence. She explained that Ayla was lactose intolerant and had been vomiting. However, a quick internet search showed that common symptoms of lactose intolerance are gas, bloating, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. While nausea and vomiting are listed, they are not the most common symptoms, let alone vomiting blood. In 2017, at Trista's request, a judge finally declared Ayla legally dead. The magistrate ruled that the death occurred around December 17, 2011, when she was reported missing by her father, Justin. With that resolution in hand, Trista and her lawyers filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Justin, alleging he caused Ayla's death through intentional unlawful acts and subjected the girl to pain prior to death, fear, terror, and physical injuries. At the time the lawsuit was filed, the subject was missing, and it was later learned that he and his lawyers denied any wrongdoing and labeled the lawsuit baseless. Faced with this, Trista decided to hold a press conference in which she addressed her dead daughter's father directly, asking him if he had any conscience.
I can see it in your eyes. And you know that's the problem. You look at me and I know you care.
Just say something, man.
Please, Justin.
Earlier this year, 2023, a judge approved Trista's petition to include Phoebe and Elisha in the wrongful death lawsuit. The three defendants are facing civil charges for wrongful death, conscious pain and suffering, and unlawful interference with the body of a deceased person. Additionally, Justin faces a charge for breaching a parent's duty to care for a minor child. Both Trista and her lawyer knew that they would not receive any financial compensation from Justin. That wasn't the goal of the lawsuit. Their objective was to reveal information and uncover the truth. There were so many strange things about Ayla's disappearance. For example, investigators told Trista something astonishing about the morning Ayla disappeared. Before calling 911, Justin drove to Portland and back. He claimed he thought Trista had taken Ayla and was looking for her, but he never called her or any of her family members. However, during that long trip, he did call his friend, who had sold him a $25,000 life insurance policy for Ayla a few weeks before. The weird thing is that Justin stayed at this friend's house while detectives advanced the investigations after the disappearance. This action was astonishing, considering that Justin stayed out of his baby's life during the 9 months of pregnancy and most of the child's existence. Trista also revealed having received strange messages from Justin in the week following the day he took Ayla. He mentioned being afraid that someone would try to kidnap her or snatch her away. The last time he said something similar was around December 11th, 6 days before the disappearance was reported. But when the child disappeared, those same messages became threatening and confusing. Trista said she had always wondered what those words meant. Residents of Santa Claus, Danny and Kim Daniels, were known throughout their community as a warm and generous couple who always had a welcoming smile for everyone. Proud parents to 4 biological children, including Jessica, Brian, and Amber Daniels, Danny and Kim also opened their home to several foster children, providing a nurturing environment for them to thrive. Tragically, the community was unaware that this display of kindness would one day lead to their shocking and horrific demise. Kimberly, known simply as Kim to her loved ones, was born on February 25, 1964, in Georgia, USA. Details about her early life are scarce, but we know she grew up in a large, highly dysfunctional family. Kim faced many challenges from a young age. She became an orphan in her early teens and spent her remaining youth moving from one foster home to another. When Kim turned 18 and aged out of the foster care system, life didn't get any easier. She had 3 children with a man whose identity remains undisclosed. Her first child, Amber, was born around 1986 or 1987 when Kim was in her 20s. Then, in January 1989, she welcomed twins Brian and Brooke. Unfortunately, Kim's troubled childhood took its toll, and her struggles with drug and alcohol addiction led to her losing custody of her children. After hitting rock bottom and being forced to live in her car, Kim decided it was time for a change. In 1992, she joined Alcoholics Anonymous, where she met Danny Daniels. Danny was born on May 21, 1950, and worked for the United States Postal Service. Danny helped Kim overcome her addiction, and their relationship blossomed into love. They married shortly after, and with the stability of their marriage, Kim regained custody of her 3 children. The Daniels family was now complete with Kim, her children Amber, Bryant, Brooke, Danny, and Jessica, a daughter Danny had previously adopted. They moved into a charming brick house in the quaint town of Santa Claus, Georgia, a place with a population of just around 300 known for its Christmas theme. The town's main attraction was its festive spirit, with everything inspired by the legendary figure of Santa Claus. The local chapel was open 24/7, featuring a walking trail in Santa's garden. During the holiday season, residents sent over 1,000 letters and postcards through a large red mailbox labeled as Santa's Mail, located on December 25th Avenue. Other street names in the town were similarly themed, like Sleigh Street and Rudolph Road. The town sign featured a drawing of Santa Claus and the phrase, "The town that loves children," written in beautiful script. The Daniels home boasted a huge fireplace and was nestled between 2 railroad ponds, surrounded by tall pines and vineyards. The Daniels family settled into their new home without any trouble and quickly became devoted members of the Pentecostal church. Kim played the piano and sang in the choir during religious services, while Danny taught Sunday school. Their kids attended the local school. To those who knew them, they epitomized the perfect family: a beautiful home, 4 children, 2 dogs, a mother dedicated to her family and community, and a father who worked hard for the well-being of his loved ones. Kim and Danny's kindness seemed to know no bounds. By the mid-90s, they had opened their doors as a foster home for children in need. Having experienced the hardships of being homeless herself, Kim felt this was a natural step, and Danny's familiarity with the adoption system made it seem like the logical choice. Over the next few years, social service workers noted that the Daniels took in about 7 children, though some sources suggested the number was much higher. One of the children they took in 1995, was a 10-year-old girl named Joanne. She was placed with the Daniels due to her toxic family environment. Both Joanne's father and stepfather were alcoholics. Various child protection service workers reported that her mother practiced black magic and voodoo. Joanne had an older brother named Jerry Scott Heidler. Born on June 9, 1977, Jerry was described as a kind young man who got along well with children. However, he faced challenges due to his difficult home life. During his high school years, he attended a school for students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and he had a criminal record for stealing from a store and a vehicle. By 1996, he was facing serious charges in the town of Alma and was on probation for driving under the influence. While Joanne was under Kim and Danny's care, Jerry often visited the family home to see her, sometimes even staying overnight. After Joanne returned to her family, Jerry continued to maintain a relationship with the Daniels. Kim and Danny wanted to help him, so they occasionally brought him along to church. This continued for over a year, but by 1997, Danny started noticing that Jerry, then 20 years old, seemed to have a particularly close relationship with his 16-year-old daughter, Jessica, and he wasn't the only one who noticed. Concerned for his daughter's welfare, Danny decided to confront Jerry. He spoke to him seriously, and after this conversation, Jerry no longer visited the Daniels' home or accompanied them to church. In December of that same year, the Daniels were getting ready to celebrate the holiday season. Christmas was Kim's favorite time of the year, a sentiment deeply rooted in her own experiences of spending many Christmas Eves alone during her years in foster care. Because of this, she went out of her way to create the best possible Christmas experience for every child in her home, both her own kids and those temporarily under her care. She spent a good part of the year collecting gifts, which she stored in the attic of the house. This year, the room was packed with toys, video games, movies, and clothes. The holiday decorations began early in December, and by the time the tree was up, it was surrounded by dozens of presents. On the night of December 3rd, 1997, the Daniels family went to bed after a day like any other. At that time, in addition to their 4 children, they were caring for 3 more foster kids: Amanda, age 9, Corey, age 4, and Gabriel, who was just 10 months old. The 2 older children had been with the Daniels for several years, and the baby had been in their care since his birth. It was clear the Daniels had grown deeply attached to these kids and were even considering officially adopting them. Sadly, they would never have the chance to fulfill this wish and give these children a permanent home. While the Daniels had started December ready to enjoy the festive season, Jerry was experiencing a completely different situation. On that same December 3rd, he attended the funeral of a baby belonging to a friend of Jerry's named Mary. Around the same time that Danny had forbidden Jerry from getting close to Jessica, Mary had become pregnant. Tragically, 6 months later, she lost the baby. While it was never confirmed whether Jerry was the father or not, the funeral was nonetheless a painful event. After the ceremony, Jerry drowned his sorrows in alcohol at a local bar, where he also played pool for a while. Several hours later, in the early hours of December 4th, Jerry stole a black van from his neighbor and drove to the Daniels' home. The family was completely asleep when Jerry entered the house through a bathroom window. He then headed straight to Kim and Danny's bedroom, where, due to his many previous visits, he was familiar with the layout of the room and knew where the gun cabinet was located. Jerry grabbed a semi-automatic shotgun and loaded it. He then walked out to the back door of the house, holding the gun in one hand, and proceeded to smoke a cigarette before re-entering the house. The sequence of what happened next remains somewhat unclear, as Jerry's own statements did not align with what was later reported during the trial. According to Jerry, he first entered the room where Bryant, one of Kim's biological sons, was sleeping. Without the 8-year-old boy even realizing what was happening, Jerry pointed the rifle at his head and fired. Bryant died instantly. The gunshot woke Jessica, who saw Jerry in the room with the weapon and immediately ran out. Jerry chased her and shot her in the back of the neck just as she entered her parents' bedroom, likely seeking help. Jerry then turned the gun on Kim and Danny, who were still in their bed. The shot aimed at Danny was not very effective, and Danny raised his arms in an attempt to protect himself. Jerry reloaded the rifle and fired 4 more times at Danny, ultimately ending his life. Although this was the sequence of events Jerry later confessed to, court documents suggest that the first victims were actually Kim and Danny. Jessica was awakened by the loud noise of the gunshots, and then came the tragic end of young Bryant. Regardless of the exact sequence, the harsh reality was that Jerry had cold-bloodedly taken 4 lives without any apparent reason. However, Jerry's criminal actions that night were not yet over. 5 more children remained alive in the house: Amber, Brooke, Amanda, Corey, and Gabriel. Some reports mention that Jerry's sister Joanne was with the Daniels at the time of the attack, but court documents clarify that she had not been in the house since her foster care stay in 1995. Jerry went to the room where the 3 girls were sleeping. He told them that a man had broken into the house and that Kim had asked him to take them to safety. The girls, who knew and trusted Jerry, believed him and followed him to the van. Gabriel, the baby, just 10 months old, and Corey, the 4-year-old, were left behind in the house with the bodies of their parents and siblings. Jerry then drove the 3 girls about 15 miles to the Altamaha River. He parked in a secluded area under a bridge and proceeded to sexually abuse 10-year-old Amber. It was not entirely clear if Brooke and Amanda witnessed this heinous attack. After raping the little girl, Jerry threw the gun into the river and continued driving with the 3 girls about 72 miles away from the Daniels' residence. After committing these horrific crimes, Jerry dropped the girls off the vehicle and left them abandoned on a dirt road. He then returned to his mother's house in the town of Alma, where he spent the next few hours sleeping and playing video games with his brother as if nothing had happened. At one point, Jerry asked his brother if he had ever killed someone. Upon receiving a no as an answer, Jerry remarked that doing so made him want to go out and harm more people. While Jerry was living out his twisted fantasies without any apparent remorse, the 3 young girls he had abandoned were walking terrified and shivering through the dirt streets, their nightgowns the only protection against the cold. Around 4 a.m., a local hero and his wife were alerted by their dog's incessant barking. Looking out the window, they saw the 3 defenseless girls in the street, immediately took them in, and called the police. The authorities arrived within minutes. Although the girls were in shock, they were coherent enough to tell the police they had been kidnapped from their home in Santa Claus, providing their address. 2 officers were dispatched to the Daniels residence. They arrived at the brick house around 5:10 a.m. on that December 4th. From the street, the silence of the house created a chilling atmosphere. The front door was open, and when no one answered their calls, the officers checked the windows and saw the arm of a young child on the top bunk of a bunk bed. They loudly announced their presence before entering the Daniels residence. With all the lights off and the winter sky still dark, the house was shrouded in shadows. As they moved through the rooms using their flashlights, the officers stumbled upon the horrifying scene of young Bryant, still clutching his teddy bear, his head covered in blood. In the background, they could hear a clock alarm and the cries of a baby. It was Gabriel, found in his crib in Kim and Danny's room. There, the police also discovered the body of Jessica, lying between the hallway and the door, and in the bed, Kim and Danny were found deceased. Corey was found hiding under a table in the kitchen, visibly terrified. The officers also noticed that the gun closet was open. The residence was declared a crime scene, and more investigators soon arrived. Suddenly, Santa Claus, a town where everyone knew each other and which prided itself on being the town that loves children, became the center of a quadruple murder and the abduction of 3 minors. This drew a rapid influx of journalists. The county prosecutor told the press that while the motive for the attack was not yet clear, it was not believed to be random. They were almost certain that the perpetrator was a friend of the Daniels, or at least someone who knew them. The scene was meticulously photographed and videotaped. Forensic technicians collected samples, vacuumed for traces of hair fibers and clothing, and found shotgun shells scattered throughout the house. There were 2 near Jessica, one in the main bathroom, another in Kim and Danny's bedroom, one in the laundry room, one in Bryant's room, and another near the sofa in the living room. A neighbor reported hearing strange noises around 1:45 a.m., but given the large distance between the houses and the general quiet of the area, did not think they could be gunshots. According to the coroner who responded to the case, Kim had received 2 shots in the stomach and arm. Danny had 4 wounds on his body and 1 in the head, which was fatal. Jessica died from a single shot in the neck, as did Bryant in the head. Although the deaths of the 2 children were instantaneous, the coroner mentioned it was possible that the 2 adults may have lingered a bit longer before dying. A cigarette butt was also found crushed against the floor near the back door. From the bathroom window, a fingerprint was collected, and these 2 pieces of evidence would help identify the perpetrator of the brutal crime. However, what the forensics team did not yet know was that over 25 miles away, at another police station, the 3 girls had already identified the culprit. Amber, Brooke, and Amanda had described the van, and authorities quickly distributed bulletins with all the relevant information, noting that the suspect might be armed and dangerous. The eldest of the 3 girls, Amber, was taken to an interrogation room where a police officer showed her a series of photographs and asked if she recognized anyone. Without hesitation, Amber pointed to Jerry. The other girls also identified him. When the police asked Amber if Jerry had harmed any of the three, she broke down and started crying inconsolably. It wasn't until a worker from the Department of Children and Family Services was called that the young victim was able to recount what had happened without any other officers present. The story of sexual abuse was corroborated by evidence of physical trauma found on Amber's body. This, combined with DNA evidence found at the scene that matched Jerry, made him the primary and only suspect in the heinous crime. Uniformed patrol officers were deployed throughout the county, where Jerry was last seen, and also in Alma, where his family lived. The search was brief and straightforward. 2 officers were sent to Jerry's family residence. Behind the house, they located the van, and as the patrol car stopped in front of the residence, Jerry was seen exiting the front door. Seeing the 2 agents, he ran back inside the house. The officers pursued him while calling for backup over the radio. Jerry's brother came out and claimed he was the only one at home at that moment, which was clearly a lie. Soon, Bacon County detectives arrived as reinforcements and started a thorough search of the property. Jerry had hidden in a crawl space under the house. When he refused to come out, 2 officers dragged him out and arrested him on an outstanding warrant for violating his parole. Jerry's brother was arrested for obstructing justice, and both were jailed without bail. Despite resisting arrest, once at the station, Jerry confessed to committing the crimes. He recounted what happened that night and admitted to disposing of the weapon in the river, which was confirmed by the young victims. The motive was never definitively established. Jerry himself said he did not know why he had done it. Some speculated that the attack was a result of Danny forbidding him from seeing Jessica, while others believed it might have been related to the grief over losing Mary's baby, who was likely Jerry's child. In his statement, Jerry said he remembered the events as if he had been in a dream. Jerry's entire confession, which included the kidnapping of the 3 girls and the abuse of Amber, was recorded on video. On December 8, 1997, just weeks before Christmas, funeral services for the 4 victims were held. After the ceremony, Danny, Kim, Jessica, and Bryant were laid to rest side by side. Although the evidence was more than sufficient, and Jerry had confessed to his crimes when it came time to plead at the trial, he remained silent. Without a plea of guilty or innocent, the court clerk automatically entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. As a result, a trial had to proceed, which was not scheduled until mid-1999. On July 6th of that year, while waiting for his trial to begin, Jerry managed to escape from his cell by sawing through the bars of his window. He was on the run for 12 hours before being recaptured and returned to jail. During a search of his cell, authorities found 75 homemade weapons and learned that he often threatened guards and other inmates. After this incident, his trial finally started on August 30th, 1999. The prosecution presented videos and photographs of the crime scene showing the condition in which the victims were found. Jerry kept his head down, refusing to look at the outcome of his actions. They also played the video of Amber's testimony, recounting everything that happened that tragic morning. Her words brought tears to the eyes of the Daniels' relatives and friends present, and even some jury members were moved. Additionally, Jerry's recorded confession was played, and the 2 officers who conducted the interrogation testified about his statements. Forensic doctors who examined the bodies testified about the number of gunshot wounds each family member received and the estimated time of death for each. A firearms expert testified that the shotgun used in the attack had a capacity for only 6 cartridges, indicating that the perpetrator must have reloaded at least once, given the number of wounds and cartridges found at the scene. The prosecutor suggested several possible motives for the murders, with the main hypothesis being that Jerry was angry over being prohibited from seeing Jessica. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded guilty but requested a verdict of insanity to avoid the death penalty. As part of this strategy, 3 court-appointed experts were required to examine the accused's mental state before the trial. During the trial, the court allowed, despite the prosecution's objections, 3 doctors who had interviewed Jerry to testify as witnesses regarding his mental health. The 3 appointed experts testified that the defendant did not suffer from any mental retardation, and his IQ was in the lower average range. They diagnosed him with borderline personality disorder, possibly accompanied by antisocial personality disorder. However, they stated that Jerry had not shown signs of a psychotic break and was responsible for his actions. They added that the accused was a drug addict and could experience hallucinations during periods of use. They agreed that he had the mental capacity to stand trial and that there was sufficient clinical documentation to consider a guilty verdict, but not for mental illness. The first phase of the trial concluded with a unanimous verdict of guilt. The jury found Jerry guilty of 4 counts of murder with malice aforethought, 3 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of kidnapping causing bodily harm, 1 count of aggravated sodomy, 1 count of aggravated child sexual abuse, another of child abuse, and 1 of burglary. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented 5 witnesses to demonstrate that Jerry was an unstable and dangerous individual. The first was a police officer who testified about finding an iron bar hidden in the defendant's prison uniform during an inspection. Next, a guard from the detention center where Jerry had been incarcerated testified that he had heard Jerry say he had not finished collecting souls. A jailer from the same facility testified that the accused had tampered with the locks on his cell door and had fashioned a weapon with which he had threatened several prison officials. This testimony was corroborated by a jail administrator who added that Jerry had escaped from the center for 12 hours just days before the trial. Finally, a prosecutor from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation testified that he had received a taunting call from the accused while in prison, in which Jerry said that of the 9 little pigs, 4 were dead, referencing the Daniels. In response, the defense called Jerry's mother to the stand. She spoke about her son's upbringing and mental health, noting that his father was an alcoholic and she had left him when Jerry was 4 years old. Following her, Jerry's sister testified. Lisa also spoke about their childhood, detailing how their family frequently moved, their father and stepfather's excessive drinking, and the latter's verbal abuse. Additionally, the director of programs at the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice testified. He had managed Jerry's family's case and mentioned that Jerry had entered the juvenile justice system at 14 or 15 years old after a confrontation with his stepfather. William Wright, a social services worker, testified that he had been in contact with the family in 1985 and had noted that Jerry's mother showed little affection towards her son. Jerry's foster mother from August 1988 to March 1989 recalled that the 11-year-old Jerry was afraid of the dark and irrationally feared that a knife might fall from the ceiling and cut him. Another doctor contacted by the defense team to assess Jerry agreed with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. On September 4th, 1999, nearly 2 years after the gruesome murder of the 4 Daniels family members, the jury found aggravating circumstances and recommended the death penalty for each of the 4 counts of murder with malice aforethought. Jerry was also sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for aggravated sodomy and kidnapping causing bodily harm, 30 consecutive years for aggravated child abuse, and 20 consecutive years for each of the remaining charges. After hearing his sentence, Jerry cried, showing emotion for the first time. The judge followed the jury's recommendation and sentenced 22-year-old Jerry to death by electric chair. The sentence was automatically appealed according to state laws, but was upheld by the Supreme Court of Georgia. Since then, Jerry has continued to appeal his case multiple times. He argues that his trial attorney was ineffective in investigating and presenting evidence regarding his mental health during the guilt phase of his trial. However, an internal investigation revealed that the defense team had exhausted all available avenues to secure a life sentence for Jerry, despite encountering numerous obstacles during the case construction. In 2001, the Supreme Court of the United States denied Jerry's request for a procedure used by higher courts to correct an error made by a lower court. The most recent appeal was made in 2023. Like all previous instances, the request was denied and the sentence was reaffirmed. As of the date of this video, Jerry is being held in the Georgia State Prison. Despite the years that have passed, the terrible events of that December morning in 1997 remain vivid in the memory of the residents of Santa Claus, a peaceful and picturesque town that loves Christmas. On December 26th, Boxing Day, a tradition in Australia hailing from medieval times transformed into a shopping frenzy, akin to America's Black Friday. Amid the hustle, Nick was seen snatching up a tent and camping chair, gearing up for a punk rock festival in New South Wales to celebrate the new year. But as the sales faded and the crowds dispersed, a chilling twist unfolded. Nick was nowhere to be found. Chris arrived in Australia around 1987, the youngest of 3 children in a family based in Canberra, Australia's capital. Canberra is unique as the only city in the country that was planned and built from scratch. His parents divorced when he was 16, a separation that seemed amicable and mutually agreed upon, prioritizing the well-being of their children to minimize trauma, which initially appeared to be successful. During this time, Chris found solace and expression in music, forming close bonds with his friends. After finishing high school, he pursued his passion for music at the National University of Australia. It's worth noting that since his teenage years, Chris had been involved in punk and heavy rock bands as a guitarist and drummer. However, the financial stability that music often fails to provide likely led him to seek employment in the local hospitality sector, where he was fortunate to find work. Despite this, many of his friends were within the punk rock scene, including a particularly distinctive individual, Nicholas Sofer, better known as Nick. Their lives were tough but filled with enjoyment. Nick was born in Australia on December 16, 1986, and grew up in the Castle Hill area. From a young age, his life was hit by a string of unfortunate events, starting with the death of his parents, the details and timing of which remain unclear. What is known is that Nick was very young when he lost his key family figures and was then raised by a cousin. Unfortunately, Nick's troubles didn't stop there. As a teenager, he started having vision problems. After seeing a specialist and undergoing various tests, he was diagnosed with cone rod dystrophy, or CRD. This condition affects color vision, causes blind spots in the center of the visual field, and leads to peripheral vision loss, progressively worsening over time. Despite these challenges, Nick's upbeat nature helped him cope well as his condition deteriorated. His zest for life led him to embark on a solo trip to the United States to attend a punk rock festival in Las Vegas. While in the U.S., he also visited Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon, among other places. There's little information about Nick's educational background or employment, though some have referred to him as a journalist. However, it's clear he had a wide circle of good friends, including Chris, who shared his central passion, punk rock music. Nick never missed a concert of this genre, gradually becoming friends with band members who couldn't help but notice his constant presence, partly because of his red hair and the distinctive orange afro he grew, which stood out in any crowd. His boundless enthusiasm was hard to miss at concerts, where he was the kind of fan who went all out to support the bands, whether the venue was packed or he was the only one there. It wasn't long before he earned the nickname Ginger Ninja. Nick's party spirit and love for punk rock meant he gradually connected, not just with fans but with the musicians themselves, often buying all their albums. His warmth won him the affection of many, so it came as no surprise that his home became the go-to place for friends and band members after concerts. Nick's place was the ultimate spot for extending the party. His close friends and family not only enjoyed the good times with him, but also looked out for him, especially after an incident at a concert where he dislocated his knee from dancing and jumping too hard. Over time, Nick and Chris's bond grew stronger, but as we know, making a living from music isn't easy. Chris struggled to get by with his gigs as a guitarist and drummer. Meanwhile, Nick's funds dwindled due to spending on local concerts, albums, and traveling to see his favorite bands. Nick then suggested that Chris move in with him to share expenses, a proposal Chris quickly accepted. By the second half of 2012, they were living together. Life was mostly smooth, except for the occasional tension due to the constant parties thrown by the Ginger Ninja that sometimes disrupted Chris's sleep for his hotel job. During this time together, Chris launched a punk rock podcast, with Nick frequently appearing as a guest, sharing his extensive knowledge of the punk scene, both locally and internationally. Chris also ventured into starting his own record label, though the outcome of that project remains unclear. Their shared love for punk rock was strong, but they had their differences, leading to some rocky moments in their cohabitation. Economic issues like rent payments and domestic chores sometimes sparked disagreements. While conflicts mostly remained verbal, friends mentioned a few minor physical altercations. By mid-2013, a dispute over an unspecified damage to a garage wall escalated, with Nick asking Chris to cover the repair costs and to move out. Chris left, and Nick eventually filed a lawsuit for the damages. Although initially demanding $2,000, they settled out of court for just $60, reportedly ending on good terms. By this time, Nick was legally blind due to his progressing condition, but maintained a high level of independence and managed his daily activities efficiently. Chris stayed with another friend before planning a trip to the United Kingdom, which was cut short when he was denied entry, forcing him to return to Canberra and live with his mother. Friends started noticing unusual behavior from Chris, who claimed Nick was turning everyone against him, a claim others found baseless. In early November, tragedy struck when Chris's grandfather passed away, deeply affecting him. The emotional toll of his loss impacted Chris, affecting not just his personal relationships but also his job performance at the restaurant where he worked. His co-workers and bosses noticed a marked decline in his appearance and efficiency. Chris often seemed to be lost in thought, zoning out even as the restaurant buzzed around him. By the third week of December, after finishing a work shift, Chris texted his boss to resign, citing mental health reasons. Friends said that in the months following his move out of Nick's house, Chris tried to rekindle their friendship, reaching out with calls and messages, but never received the response he hoped for. Friendship is a two-way street, and Nick wasn't interested in reconnecting. On Christmas night 2013, their group of friends gathered at a well-known local pub, providing a chance for Nick and Chris to meet again. They sat together, seemingly at ease, and Chris even invited Nick to join him for dinner the next day, to which Nick agreed. However, when Chris tried to confirm the dinner plans on December 25th, he couldn't reach Nick, and the meeting never happened. December 26th, Boxing Day, followed, a holiday rooted in medieval times when masters would give gift boxes to their servants the day after Christmas. Today, in Australia and other countries, Boxing Day resembles Black Friday in the US, with stores offering significant discounts. Nick was seen shopping for a personal tent and camping chair that day, planning to use them for an upcoming punk rock festival in New South Wales with friends to ring in the new year. After that, Nick vanished. His disappearance was out of character, especially with an important concert looming. Concerned, his friends tried contacting him through messages and calls, but got no response. On December 28th, a couple of them went to his house to check on him, but despite their persistent knocking, there was only silence. One of them peered through a window and was struck by horror. He saw Nick's body lying on the kitchen floor in a scene that was shockingly gruesome, marked by the state of his body and the amount of blood. In a panic, the friends dialed Australia's emergency number, 000, and soon after, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. They forced their way in but quickly realized that Nick had succumbed to numerous stab wounds and had been dead for some time. After the body was taken away, investigators began piecing together what had happened and, more crucially, who was behind this horrific crime. Initially, they considered a botched robbery, but ruled it out with the help of Nick's friends, who confirmed that nothing was missing. Everything in the house was intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. The news deeply affected Nick's wide circle of friends and even prompted his friend Donnie to travel from Thailand to attend the funeral and try to make sense of the tragedy. The police continued their investigation and awaited forensic results, urging anyone with information to come forward or anonymously contact Crime Stoppers. Meanwhile, Nick's many friends created a social media page titled Remembering the Ginger Ninja, where they posted photos and memories from concerts and trips, showcasing Nick's ever-smiling face and the love he had cultivated throughout his life. Nick's funeral took place on January 10, 2014. Anticipating a large turnout, the announcement requested carpooling to ease parking concerns. Instead of flowers, mourners were asked to donate towards organizing an annual punk rock festival in Nick's memory. As expected, the event saw massive attendance from friends across Australia and many others touched by Nick's story. Chris, who had lived with Nick, was also there at the farewell. Additionally, a collection of band t-shirts was prepared for attendees to sign, which would accompany Nick on his final journey as the search for the perpetrator continued. With the autopsy results in hand, police were certain they were dealing with a crime of unusual brutality, as Nick's body had 73 puncture and slash wounds. Some wounds were so severe they passed completely through his body. 3 critical injuries to his neck, severing major arteries, were fatal. Investigators scoured the crime scene area for evidence and collected statements from Nick's closest friends. These interviews likely pointed them toward the prime suspect. Reports suggested a tip-off to Crime Stoppers also steered the investigation in the right direction. Friends interviewed by the police shared insights into Nick and Chris's deteriorating relationship. After Chris moved out of Nick's house, he tried to mend their friendship, but Nick was hesitant to reconnect. During the investigation, it emerged that Chris's behavior had become erratic. He would sometimes zone out, making conversations difficult, and he would repeat things already discussed. Significantly, it was revealed that Chris had mental health issues and had stopped taking his medication in the months leading up to the crime. Friends also mentioned Chris was inquiring about the progress of the investigation, urging them to share any information they might have. Chris himself was interviewed by police and claimed he last saw Nick from a distance on Boxing Day while making purchases in a store, and they did not speak. When asked about his activities later that night, he said he was feeding his cat or a neighbor's cat, according to some accounts. Chris's mother had been worried about him in the months before the incident and had contacted the mental health service treating her son to express her concerns. His therapist noted Chris's moodiness, avoidance of eye contact, distraction, and refusal to take his medication. In late January 2014, officers visited a property owned by Chris's family in New South Wales. The search involved police divers and emergency service members, leading to the discovery of items that became key forensic evidence in the case. By mid-February 2014, weeks after the incident, police arrested Chris as the prime suspect in Nick's death. He was charged on February 15, 2014, pleading not guilty due to mental impairment. This was just the beginning, and the trial would be delayed as prosecutors requested more time to prepare their case. By August, the prosecution was ready to proceed in the Supreme Court, but the case didn't reach the higher court until the end of 2015. In the interim, Chris underwent regular evaluations by mental health specialists who diagnosed him with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. The prosecutor argued that Chris had harbored resentment and a sense of isolation from their shared friend group, driven by Nick's supposed influence. She claimed that on Boxing Day, Chris had seen Nick shopping from afar but didn't approach him. Later that night, Chris took 2 knives to Nick's house, was let in, and then attacked Nick in the kitchen in a fit of rage and revenge. The assault was so fierce that one knife broke, but Chris continued with the other, inflicting 73 wounds. He then took the weapons, a tent, and chairs Nick had bought, drove to a family property, and attempted to burn the blood-stained clothes and knives. However, the fire did not destroy the metal, and Chris disposed of the remains in a dam on the property. Nick's defense attorney told the jury that the crucial issue was Chris's mental state during the attack, suggesting that the frenzied nature of the assault indicated a lack of mental control. The prosecution countered, highlighting Chris's lies to the police and noting he never mentioned hearing voices compelling him to kill Nick until after the crime, suggesting it was a strategic defense move. Throughout the trial, jurors heard from friends of both men. They described Chris's blame on Nick for social rejection within their music-loving circle. Witnesses at the trial also recounted Chris's odd behavior at the victim's wake and described him as socially awkward, prone to making bizarre statements and asking peculiar questions. Witnesses claimed to have seen Chris at concerts after the incident, noting a significant decline in his ability to communicate. A childhood friend testified that after the police searched Chris's home, he received desperate calls from Chris, who claimed he was going insane alone. In an unusual move during the trial, jurors were given iPads to view the knives used in the attack and the autopsy photos of Nick, exposing them to the gruesome evidence. Testimonies from mental health experts who had treated Chris were particularly striking. One expert noted that Chris was guarded and seemingly withheld information during an interview post-crime. It was revealed that Chris had been diagnosed with psychotic depression in 2011, but had stopped taking his medication a few months before attacking Nick. Another expert shared that Chris had been hearing voices and believed he was under surveillance by supposed criminal gang members, whom he referred to as observers capable of mind reading. Chris claimed these observers sent messages indicating that Nick had hired a hitman to kill his family members. A forensic psychiatrist stated that Chris linked his grandfather's death to a dispute with Nick over superfoods, believing Nick was in league with the observers and responsible for the death as punishment. Chris had no intention of harming Nick until he supposedly saw an envelope of money thanked by Nicky, which he interpreted as payment for his grandfather's death. On the night of the crime, Chris saw a book cover with the word loose, leading him to believe the hitman was free and a threat to his family. This vision, along with imagining his mother with a necklace like a noose, convinced Chris that Nick posed a real danger. When asked why he killed Nick instead of contacting the police, Chris felt it was his only realistic option. He later told the specialist that while driving to his family's property after the attack, he saw a car with 9 of 10 inches written on it, interpreting it as a score for the crime's execution. Chris attended Nick's funeral, believing his absence would be suspicious. The forensic psychiatrist concluded that, if incarcerated, Chris would require extensive treatment before potential release. The prosecution challenged these statements, questioning the likelihood of a psychotic individual providing a detailed account of their actions post-crime. They argued that it would be even more challenging for someone who committed a crime during a psychotic episode to do so, especially given the specific details Chris had provided. Moreover, they highlighted inconsistencies in Chris's story over time, noting changes during various interviews with mental health professionals. The prosecution also pointed out Chris's initial lies to the authorities, where he claimed the attack started at the front door, while forensic evidence showed it occurred at the dining table. They emphasized that Chris was aware enough to attempt covering up his crime by burning the weapons in his clothes. Throughout the 3-week trial, Chris remained silent. By the first week of December 2015, the jury was ready to deliberate. The judge outlined their options: guilty of murder, not guilty by reason of mental impairment, or guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. After 2 days, the jury found Chris guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. Nick's family and friends felt a sense of relief at the verdict, though sentencing would wait until February 2016. During the sentencing hearing, a friend of Nick expressed guilt for not being able to protect him and fear at the thought of Chris being free. Nick's cousin, who cared for him after their parents' death, shared her devastation and the heartbreak over the details of his final moments, calling Chris's actions a theft of an innocent, kind, and loving person. The prosecution, noting Chris's ability to mask his symptoms for 2 years, branded him a skilled liar and a community threat, requesting a 20-year sentence, the maximum for the conviction. However, the psychiatrist reported Chris's expressions of remorse and recognition of the tragedy he caused, wishing he had not committed the act. After considering all the arguments, the judge took considerable time to deliberate, ultimately sentencing Christopher Navin to 12 years in prison on May 30th, with a mandatory minimum of 6 years before parole eligibility. Following the decision, Nick's family expressed dissatisfaction, deeming the sentence too lenient and failing to meet their expectations. They described Nick as a harmless, kind, and gentle person who couldn't defend himself against Chris's attack, wishing for him to be remembered for his life rather than his tragic end. They vowed to keep his memory and dreams alive. Public reaction on social media also echoed this sentiment, with many criticizing the sentence as overly lenient. Considering time already served, Christopher was eligible for early release in 2020, which he reportedly obtained, subsequently living with his parents under a new name, with no further public information available about him. In honoring Nick's dream, his friends successfully organized the first Ginger Fest in 2014, a tribute to the beloved Ginger Ninja. Ginger Fest continued until at least 2018 with significant punk rock band support, keeping alive the memory of a young man who lived and breathed punk rock music, hoping he continued to enjoy it wherever he was. Those who knew Nick remembered him as a source of joy, hope, and love, achievements far beyond what many accomplish in a lifetime. In the mid-1990s in Spain, 2 young Romani teenagers, Rosa and Marcelino Vega, defied societal expectations by getting married before reaching legal adulthood. For them and their community, navigating life was already a complex affair. The Romani people, officially termed by the European Union, have been part of Europe for nearly a millennium. As it stands, they are Europe's most significant ethnic minority, numbering between 8 and 10 million. Despite their population size, the Romani continue to face severe challenges, from school segregation and forced relocations to being marginalized into ghettos. They also struggle with restricted employment prospects solely based on their heritage and limited access to healthcare and other essential public services. So far, no resolution from the European Union's governing bodies has managed to effectively address these issues. Yet, despite facing all these adversities, Rosa and Marcelino fell in love and chose to build a life together. Adding another layer of uniqueness to their story, especially from a Western perspective, is the fact that they were cousins. Immaculata had a unique dual relationship with Rosa, being both her aunt and mother-in-law, as well as the matriarch to the 4 other children. In the Romani community from which they hailed, there was a strong focus on keeping unions within the family to preserve their cultural heritage and lineage. Such unions were prioritized over relationships with non-Romani individuals, often referred to as payos. At the tender age of 15, Rosa and Marcelino embarked on the journey of family life. Their first son, Adolfo, arrived swiftly and was marked by his quintessential Romani features, dark skin and jet black hair. His grandmother affectionately dubbed him Diablo Moreno, or a dark-skinned devil. Shortly thereafter, Jonathan was born. Unlike his brother, he had lighter skin, which made him appear more like a payo. His blue eyes were as luminous as sunlight dancing on the sea, and his unruly blonde locks earned him the lifelong nickname Chucky, reminiscent of the messy-haired doll from the notorious 90s horror movie. The young family shared a humble abode with Immaculata, a small 2-room wooden house lacking doors, situated in the Romani community of Las Castellanas in Madrid. This settlement was predominantly composed of extended family members who relied on collective support to navigate their persistent financial struggles. The Vega family, Marcelino's lineage, was an established Romani clan. They had transitioned from agricultural labor to scavenging and selling an assortment of inexpensive goods, from garlic to brass, in a bid to make ends meet. Amid this backdrop of hardship, Rosa and Marcelino received news that they were expecting a 3rd child when Jonathan was still an infant. Their joy, however, was tragically short-lived. On the fateful morning of August 7, 1998, Marcelino, then only 19 years old, died tragically. He was riding in the back seat of a car that crashed at a speed of 200 km/h on a highway near Barcelona, Spain. Shortly after the tragic loss of Marcelino, Rosa gave birth to a daughter whom she named Carmen. Unfortunately, Marcelino was no longer around to hold her in his arms, leaving Rosa as another young Romani mother facing the challenges of raising her children alone. This was the reality for many impoverished Romani families. They neither controlled lucrative antique markets nor were involved in large drug trafficking operations. Along the way, they had also lost the traditional skill of basket weaving, which once provided extra income. Long gone were the days of field work. They had moved to the city to scrape a living from scavenging. Despite these challenges, they aimed to remain united and uphold the traditions that made them feel at home, no matter where they were. Life moved on for Rosa and her children. Fast forward to Saturday, May 27, 2000, past 2 p.m. in the Romani community of Las Castellanas in San Fernando de Henares, Marcelino's birthday was being commemorated. He would have turned 21 that day had he not died in a car accident 2 years prior. As per Romani custom, the birthdays of the deceased are remembered. To mark the occasion, Many in the community visited the cemetery to lay flowers and pay their respects. In Romani culture, the life of a departed loved one is celebrated as well as the life that could have been, no matter how short. On that day, children were running around and playing after having finished their meals. The adults were split between various tasks. Some were scavenging for scrap metal to sell, others were resting after lunch, and some had gone to the cemetery for Marcelino's birthday. Among the group of children, all of whom were cousins, was little Jonathan, the middle child of the late Marcelino and Rosa. By that time, he was already 2 years and 8 months old. Jonathan was an energetic and spirited little boy. On that particular day, his 17-year-old Aunt Isabel was looking after him. She took him and a few of his young cousins to a nearby shopping mall called Pryka for an outing. They strolled around for a while, enjoying some sweets before opting to capture the moment in a photo booth. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Isabel, upon collecting the booth's photographs, discovered that Jonathan was missing. In a state of alarm, she combed through the Pryka Mall, repeatedly entering and exiting, all the while shouting Jonathan's name. Seeing no trace of him, she raced back to their community to rally the family. By the evening, after formally reporting his disappearance to the police, national authorities joined the search efforts, with firefighters getting involved the following morning. Realizing the gravity of the missing child situation, no one took the matter lightly. Even tracking dogs were deployed, but they yielded no clues regarding Jonathan's whereabouts. Officials soon dismissed the idea that Jonathan had simply wandered off and gotten stuck in nearby natural areas or construction debris. Specifically, the under-construction M45 highway, located not far from their settlement, was examined but ruled out as a location where Jonathan might have been. The next day, both print and TV news featured the unsettling story of a Romani child kidnapped in broad daylight from a mall. The news stunned and worried the public, highlighting the urgency and seriousness of the situation. The community and authorities continued their search, hoping for any lead that could bring Jonathan back to his family. In reaction, both Rosa's and Marcelino's families invoked their deep-rooted communal bonds, managing to gather over 200 Romani individuals from various cities like Sevilla, Malaga, Barcelona, Oviedo, and Madrid. Day and night, they combed the areas around Madrid. Although financial resources were limited, they created and posted makeshift flyers at gas stations in the vicinity, but all efforts were in vain. As hours turned into days, desperation escalated. Investigators revisited Pryka, the scene of Jonathan's disappearance, and reviewed the available security footage, which unfortunately did not offer any insights due to its outdated technology. A woman who claimed to have been at the mall on that fateful Saturday reported seeing a tall, dark man giving a child, who resembled Jonathan, a bag of sweets before leading him to a children's ride. She later saw them at a cafe, where the man had a beer before departing with the child. However, her account could not be verified. The chief investigator assured everyone that they were treating the case as a high priority and even initiated an international alert via Interpol. Accompanying Jonathan's picture, they provided his description: blue eyes, blonde hair, approximately 3.3 feet tall, around 55 pounds, with milk teeth, dressed in a blue one-piece suit. With no stone left unturned, his family blanketed Madrid with posters featuring Jonathan's image and a contact number. Unfortunately, the numerous calls received were not all sincere or helpful. Numerous theories were considered, yet none provided answers. The concept of abduction became increasingly likely both within the family and from a law enforcement standpoint. One avenue explored was a potential clash between different Romani families. Authorities questioned countless individuals, and the regional government representative at the time, Francisco Xavier Anzurtegui, consulted with heads of Romani families in Madrid. All claimed ignorance about the young boy's disappearance, insisting he wasn't in the hands of any clan. Financial motives were also scrutinized. The family revealed they were awaiting a large insurance payment of 25 million pesetas, approximately $139,000 following Marcelino's death, making it conceivable that someone aimed to claim the money. The family was plagued by anomalous phone calls from a hoarse-voiced man, asserting he had Jonathan, yet no demands were made. While police pursued this lead, it yielded no results. Disturbingly, other calls came in featuring the sounds of a child crying, heightening the family's anguish. These calls were later traced back to a psychologically unstable woman who used a doll to simulate the cries. As days passed with no ransom request, the likelihood of a kidnapping for financial reasons waned. After 2 torturous weeks, Jonathan's location remained a mystery. During this period, the non-stop ringing of the household phone escalated their emotional turmoil. Calls came from inquisitive journalists or individuals offering moral support, but no concrete help. Jonathan remained headline news, yet this offered no advantage in finding him. Immaculata, a grandmother of 38, epitomized the challenges faced by the poor Romani community, enduring the heartache of the situation while striving to keep her family's spirits alive in the face of such adversity. Prematurely aged by years of hardship and now further diminished by grief, she nonetheless endeavored to support her niece, Rosa, a young widow with a child missing. Amidst this devastating situation, Rosa attempted to nurse her 15-month-old daughter, Carmen, who was too young to comprehend the tragedy unfolding around her. Rosa was eating poorly and seemed to be withering away from the inside. A report from the newspaper El País depicted their community, Las Castellanas, as a mud-filled hamlet dotted with makeshift dwellings. Home to 50 to 60 families and encircled by emaciated, unresponsive dogs, the settlement presented a bleak picture of life on the margins. In the summer of 2000, Rosa received the insurance settlement from Marcelino's untimely death. Although it brought some financial respite, the 14 million pesetas were less than they initially expected. Committed to finding her missing son, Rosa designated 7 million pesetas as a reward for information that could lead to Jonathan. She spent the remaining money on a van and countless flyers featuring Jonathan's image. Rosa also purchased additional phones to handle potential leads and, accompanied by relatives, began a relentless journey. They traveled throughout Spain and even crossed into France and Portugal in the hopes of locating Jonathan. Regrettably, the search only deepened their sense of loss and despair. At just 21 years old, Rosa pledged to continue the search for her son, even if it meant walking the entire country with only a cane to aid her. As days stretched into months, a grueling 6 months had passed when Rosa's hope for a family reunion was brutally dashed. One evening, while watching television, they heard a breaking news report. A truck driver had stumbled upon skeletal remains not far, about 1.5 kilometers away, from the shopping center where Jonathan had last been seen. Given the closeness, it was feared that the remains could be Jonathan's. The news stunned the tight-knit Romani community and extinguished any lingering hope that the boy would be found alive. Interestingly, the media stated that this particular area had supposedly been scoured in the initial frantic searches for Jonathan. The bones were located near the construction site of Madrid's M45 highway. The truck driver had stopped to assess the site before unloading soil from the construction project. When he saw the small skull, he immediately thought of Jonathan and reported his discovery, even as the soil was being dumped at that location. The police acted swiftly, using heavy machinery to unearth a fractured skull and a few ribs with no obvious marks of violence. Nearby, they discovered children's clothing, a blue overall, a shirt, and a pair of shoes, all faded but intact. Rosa and Jonathan's grandmother identified these garments as the clothes Jonathan was wearing when he disappeared. To the family, it became clear what had tragically occurred. The authorities advised them to wait for conclusive DNA test results for final verification. A week later, the family received confirmation that the discovered remains were indeed Jonathan's. Rosa, his mother, was so overwhelmed by the news that she had to be hospitalized and treated for acute anxiety. The confirmation brought a tragic closure to the long search, leaving the family to grapple with the painful reality of their loss and the need to seek justice for Jonathan. The emotional toll of searching for her son for 6 months culminated in the heartbreaking discovery of his remains. Debate arose about whether the area where the remains were found had been adequately searched earlier. The local security official claimed that this particular stretch had been overlooked because it was beyond the expected radius of where Jonathan might be found. This discrepancy led to differing opinions among the community and authorities. Some thought the remains had been there all along, while others suspected they had been moved recently. A regular forager and the landowner of the area both stated they hadn't noticed anything unusual. Police refrained from speculating how the fragmented skull, lower jaw, and ribs ended up near the construction site. However, the regional governor suggested that the remains might have been brought there by the truck dumping soil for the construction. The family held fast to their belief that Jonathan was criminally taken, asserting that he would never have wandered off by himself. They clarified, however, that they didn't suspect anyone in particular, noting that if they had, they would have enacted their own form of justice in keeping with the Romani code of an eye for an eye. Clarity remained elusive in the case, and forensic analysis of the remains could not ascertain the cause of Jonathan's death. He was laid to rest in a modest white coffin beside his father, in a funeral attended by just over 20 people, all grappling with the unresolved tragedy. Through it all, Rosa was visibly shattered, unable to stop her tears and suffering from multiple collapses. Although the case remains open, police have made no significant progress. To this day, the circumstances surrounding Jonathan's death remain a mystery, lacking both justice and explanation. Aaron was born on July 15, 1994, in the United States to unknown parents. Fortunately, she was adopted by Lore and William, a couple from Tennessee. They had 7 children in total, with 5 of them being adopted, including Aaron. For Lore and William, adopting was more than a decision. It was about following a divine command to help those in need, especially since some of their adopted children had special needs. For instance, their youngest, Trisha, was born with multiple birth defects. From early childhood, while growing up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Aaron showed a remarkable and unconditional love for animals. Her mother cherished memories of Aaron being the only one who could make a rabbit walk on a leash as if it were a dog. Kind-hearted and gentle, Aaron enjoyed the benefits of having a loving and united family, facing only the usual challenges of any average household. When Trisha passed away at just 3.5 years old, Lore and William helped their grieving children understand the importance of having provided a happy life for her. Over time, Aaron turned her affinity for animals into a special talent for taming horses that no one else could tame. She had a pony named Riley at a stable near her home. In 5th grade, she met Jonathan Corwin, a boy a year older than her. Initially, they were not particularly close, but about 5 years later, they started chatting on social media. By then, Aaron's protective nature had led her to become the mother of dozens of animals, ranging from fish and guinea pigs to dogs and cats, all of whom she welcomed and cared for. Eventually, Jonathan plucked up the courage to ask her out, choosing her 16th birthday for the date. With her parents' permission, their love blossomed. Their romance, full of poem exchanges and shared dreams, turned them into the quintessential American couple. After finishing high school, Erin found employment at a local tractor supply company, spending her free time with her horse or scouring garage sales with her mother and siblings. Meanwhile, Jonathan joined the Marine Infantry, and without hesitation about their bright future, they married in Las Vegas in November 2012. The following year, Jonathan learned he would be transferred to California. While the prospect excited both him and Erin, they planned to return to East Tennessee as soon as possible. In September 2013, the newlyweds moved to their new home at the Marine base in San Bernardino County. In turn, the location served as one of the entry points to Joshua Tree National Park. Here, they met new people, such as the couple Connor and Aisling Maliki, who live with their young son Brian on the ground floor of the same block as Erin and her husband. Amid daily tasks, Jonathan also struck up a friendship with another colleague, Christopher Brandon Lee. Son of Karen Lee and hailing from Anchorage, Alaska, Christopher was a Marine who had been going through tough times after returning from a tour in Afghanistan. He lived on the base with his wife Nicole and their 6-year-old daughter Liberty. Like Erin, the couple shared a love for horses. Soon, the three couples became friends. While their husbands were on duty, Erin, Aisling, and Nicole would visit each other to have lunch and chat. When Jonathan, Connor, and Christopher were at home, they would cook or watch movies and TV shows in any of their apartments. It seemed like each home was everyone's home. Additionally, Christopher and his wife Nicole became horse sponsors at the Roca Blanca Ranch, which also hosted a non-profit organization dedicated to animal care and protection. Isabel Megley owned the site. Naturally, upon learning about it, Erin joined the initiative. Amid their military duties, everything seemed to go smoothly. Initially, Christopher seemed to fit well with the uniform, but over time, other Marines noticed he often displayed a mix of disorder and insolence in handling weapons. An officer later reprimanded him for treating rifles and rocket launchers as if they were toys, earning Christopher a reputation for being reckless. For the Corwins, everyday life, far from their respective families, presented challenges that strained their relationship beyond the honeymoon phase. Their youth also meant they were not fully prepared for the challenges of marriage, often arguing over money and accusing each other of overspending. However, when Erin became pregnant, all disagreements and bitterness between her and Jonathan dissolved. She was so happy with the news that she announced it with a blue and pink post on her social media profile. Unfortunately, just a few weeks later, Erin suffered a miscarriage, which devastated her emotionally. To make matters worse, Jonathan's frequent deployments for military exercises far from the base added physical and emotional distance, as she felt he was unable to console her. Consequently, the cracks in their marriage not only reappeared, but also deepened. During the free time they shared, Christopher had been watching Erin and found it easy to discern the depth of sadness on her face. From that moment, he began spending more time with Erin without Nicole around. On a Sunday night in February 2014, the Lees joined the Corwins in their apartment. Jonathan and Nicole chose to watch a zombie series episode, but Erin, put off by the violence, declined to join. Instead of staying with his wife, Christopher went with Erin to the master bedroom to play video games. Alone, sitting side by side on the floor, they spent a few minutes in front of the screen until one of them paused the game and they looked at each other. Suddenly, they shared their first kiss, Although it lasted only a moment, that intimate gesture changed everything, and they began an affair that quickly escalated in intensity. Soon, Aaron and Christopher were talking about leaving their spouses and how great a stepmother she would be to Liberty, whom she frequently cared for. Meanwhile, Nicole sensed her husband's growing distance and soon checked his cell phone, discovering the text messages between Christopher and Aaron. Nicole was furious and confronted Christopher with a monologue filled with bitter words that lasted for hours. She didn't stop there, though. She also informed Jonathan about the affair, causing a heated confrontation that lasted through the night. When Aaron tried to leave, Nicole, eyes blazing with rage, screamed threats at her. Aaron and Christopher ended their affair, but weeks later, they resumed their secret meetings. Around this time, Christopher wrote Aaron a poem, urging her not to give up. Meanwhile, unaware of the ongoing betrayal, Jonathan was determined to make his marriage work. Then, on June 22, 2014, as Aaron anxiously awaited her mother's first visit to California, she discovered she was pregnant again, this time undoubtedly with Christopher's child. Though she didn't announce it on social media, she told him. Initially, Christopher feigned happiness, but in reality he was displeased, fearing the news could disrupt his plans. Despite promising a future together to Aaron, Christopher had no intention of leaving his wife and was greatly fearful of Nicole's potential reaction to the pregnancy. His time in the Marines was nearing its end. On July 4, 2014, he was scheduled to finish his service and then planned to return to Alaska with his wife, leaving behind the tumultuous affair. The next day, Christopher told Isabel that he had been exploring the desert and was thrilled about the interesting things he had found, particularly excited about discovering a hard-to-reach mine shaft. He then asked to borrow a white propane tank that she owned. Isabel had no objections. Meanwhile, he started researching online how to dispose of a body. Then, he messaged Aaron to invite her for a surprise romantic evening in the national park. Filled with excitement, Aaron immediately texted a friend in Tennessee to share the news. They speculated about the true intentions of her lover and the mention of a surprise element. When her friend sent a text with a ring emoji, Aaron admitted she was excited about the possibility of a marriage proposal. The date was set for June 28th. Christopher told his wife he had planned a coyote hunting trip in Joshua Tree National Park with Connor, which conveniently allowed him to take his Winchester .22 caliber rifle. Early that day, he also loaded up the propane tank and gasoline. Before leaving, he mentioned to Nicole that Connor had canceled so he would go alone. Around 7:30 that morning, Aaron told Jonathan she was heading to Joshua Tree National Park to explore the trails that she and her mother could later bike on. She kissed him goodbye and said she loved him, leading her husband to believe that their life was returning to normal. Once at the meeting point, Aaron faced a harsh disillusionment. Not only was there no dream marriage proposal, but Christopher also made it clear that he had no affection for her whatsoever. She was confronted with a man consumed by anger, with her as the target of his rage. What happened next is largely known only to him, but it is known that he fired shots into the air before using a rope tied to 2 reinforcement bars to strangle Aaron, cutting off her air supply. After she fell to the ground, he checked her vital signs and, ensuring she was not breathing, threw her into the mine shaft he had discovered days earlier. Aaron fell 76 meters deep. As hours passed with no news from his wife, Jonathan became anxious. He tried calling her at least 50 times and eventually reported her missing the next morning. When the young soldier also contacted his mother-in-law, she suspected that her daughter, who always had trouble with directions, might have gotten lost in the vast national park. Several days passed with no information about Aaron's whereabouts. When new information finally emerged, it was far from reassuring. A woman living in a remote area noticed that a car had been parked near her house for several days, which was very unusual. She took pictures of the car and shared them, hoping the owner would appear. These photos turned out to be crucial, as it was discovered that the car belonged to Aaron. When the police informed Aaron's family that they had found her car abandoned several kilometers north of the park, she felt a stab in her heart. To her, it was almost a certain sign that her daughter had encountered something sinister. The police shared a similar sentiment. From that point, the authorities had two tasks, one more challenging than the other. The first task was to gather evidence to prosecute a potential attacker. In this regard, San Bernardino's detectives began to delve into Aaron's life and soon uncovered hidden aspects that might have endangered her. It was through their investigations that Jonathan learned his wife's affair had continued in secret. This detail quickly led the police to rule out the husband as a suspect. Instead, Christopher became the focus of their investigation, especially after tire tracks found near Aaron's car seemed to match his vehicle. Consequently, on July 1st, 2014, Christopher was interviewed by the police. By then, he had hidden his rifle at Isabel's ranch. Christopher initially apologized for not disclosing his relationship with Aaron, claiming their interactions had never crossed the boundaries set by their respective marriages. Then, unexpectedly, he claimed that Aaron had confided in him about being a victim of domestic abuse. Regarding the Saturday she disappeared, he admitted being in the national park area alone, ostensibly to hunt coyotes, hence firing his gun at rocks. However, the police confronted him with the evidence, leading Christopher to change his story. Without a body, the investigators could not pressure him further. At that point, there was no way to prove Aaron was deceased. So after 9 hours lacking sufficient evidence to charge him, the authorities had to let Christopher go. The police were convinced that the story provided by the main suspect was highly unusual and implausible. Later, when the detectives spoke with Nicole, they noted her uncooperative attitude, almost as if she resented the investigation. Christopher was eventually discharged from the Marine Corps, and as planned, he and his wife packed their bags, loaded their truck, and, along with Little Liberty, headed back to Alaska. Meanwhile, the police's second and more daunting task was to locate Aaron's remains and prove that this was not a mere case of spontaneous disappearance. The investigation seemed to stall, and the detectives were frustrated. Until Isabel remembered that the week before Aaron's disappearance, Christopher had mentioned going to the national park with a friend to explore mines, referencing one that nobody would find. Determined to follow this lead, they sought the help of a local expert, skilled and familiar with the scattered mines across the terrain. Guided by this expert, the investigators and volunteers in California began a meticulous search for Aaron in the park. They covered 3,000 square kilometers of wilderness, with 6 different law enforcement agencies eventually getting involved. However, after several weeks of searching, there were no favorable results, leading to the difficult decision to end the operation on Saturday, August 16, 2014. Yet, in a surprising twist of fate on that day, a spelunker noticed a strong smell of gasoline coming from one of the mines. In the final hours of that day, volunteers lowered a bucket with a camera into the mine. At 9 meters down, the oxygen level in the pit was toxic, and further down, near 30 meters, they discovered what appeared to be a body. After a tremendous effort in the late hours of that Saturday in August, the body was retrieved, 2 months after Aaron's disappearance. A propane tank was also found at the bottom of the mine, believed to be part of a failed attempt to destroy the victim's body. The remains were airlifted to the local morgue, where, due to advanced decomposition, Dental records were used for identification. It was confirmed to be Aaron, who had died from asphyxiation caused by an object still clutched around her neck. Additionally, it was revealed that she was pregnant. The shocking discovery that Aaron and her unborn child had been killed sent her family on an emotional roller coaster. Though it was the worst possible news, for her mother at least, it was more bearable than the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing her whereabouts. For now, her mother only hoped that her daughter's body would be returned to Tennessee for a proper burial. With Christopher having the motive, means, and opportunity and evidence piling up against him, he was soon arrested by a police officer in Anchorage, and his vehicle was confiscated. Inside the car, beneath the passenger seat, authorities found a homemade object similar to the one found around Aaron's neck. This led the police to interview Christopher's mother. Although she knew nothing about the item and claimed never to have seen it, a search of her home later uncovered a magazine edition featuring an article on Aaron's case. Following Christopher's arrest, the case attracted national media attention. Shortly after, the San Bernardino's police held a press conference to provide details on the case. They mentioned that Christopher was the main suspect in the crime. They also searched Isabel's ranch to her utter astonishment, where they found and seized a rifle owned by Christopher. Further complicating his situation, investigators discovered incriminating search histories on his internet activity. Consequently, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder. On Friday, September 19, 2014, hundreds of candles flickered in silent memory and tribute to Aaron and the unborn child whose life was cut short. Approximately 250 people attended the vigil, many wearing special T-shirts with Aaron's name on the front and a Bible verse on the back. During this time, Jonathan agreed to speak with only one media outlet among the many seeking his comment. In an interview, he expressed his hatred for Christopher's actions, but stated he felt that harboring hatred every time he saw him would eventually consume him. Jonathan revealed that he had learned about the rekindled affair and that his wife disappeared when she went to see Christopher, who was still his next-door neighbor. Part of him wanted to confront Christopher violently, but he refrained, believing it would make him no better than Christopher. Jonathan did not want to be a bad person. The legal process for obtaining justice for Aaron Corwin began 2 years later in October 2016. From the outset of the trial against Christopher, the prosecution easily established his penchant for violence and his motive and opportunity to commit the crime. On Wednesday, October 19th, a forensic scientist testified that a .22 caliber bullet casing was found near the mine where Aaron's body was discovered, and the firing pin marks on the casing matched Christopher's gun. When it was the defense's turn, Christopher was presented as the sole witness. He took the stand and, despite confirming all evidence against him, confessed to killing Aaron. However, he then offered a narrative of the events that was clearly not only false but also desperate. He claimed he had suspected that Aaron had abused his daughter while caring for her, leading to a so-called revelation on that fateful Saturday in the desert. In light of his narrative, Christopher believed he had ample justification for his actions, clearly hoping that his macabre story would result in a lesser sentence. Throughout the trial, he maintained a demeanor of cooperation and calmness. However, the jury did not believe a single word of his account. After just 15 minutes of deliberation, Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder. The following month, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In response to the tragedy, Aaron's family and some civic groups advocated for a petition to the Bureau of Land Management, urging them to provide funding and resources to seal abandoned vertical mine shafts, starting with the one where Aaron Corwin perished. Recognizing the enormity of the task and acknowledging that some public areas had already been closed, They requested prioritization for this particular area to prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. Reflecting on the entire ordeal and the relief of reaching a conclusive verdict, Aaron's mother admitted feeling emotionally and physically drained by the end of the sentencing hearing. She had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for over 2 years, with her grief so heavy that she could barely walk. Yet, following the verdict and sentencing, she felt an immense burden lifted off her shoulders, likening her emotional response to the day she finally adopted Aaron. She described years of uncertainty in the adoption process and how all the stress vanished the moment she gave Aaron her last name, mirroring her relief upon hearing Christopher's sentence. As for Jonathan Corwin, Aaron's husband, he chose to shield himself from media overexposure and was taking steps to rebuild his life after the tragic loss.